jolt. And there are wildlings, right? And your little brother, he can't walk? There are ravens everywhere, maybe even dragons. Bran fell from a tower. He can't use his legs anymore, Arya said matter-of-factly. And yet, Winterfell's full of ravens. Dragons? Well, they're in the stories, but I've never seen one. Charles froze. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. Of course. Everything suddenly clicked. He had felt it before, the strange familiarity of this place, the way the names and faces tugged at something buried deep in his memory. And now he finally understood why. This wasn't just some random medieval world. This was Westeros. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire, of kings and betrayal, dragons and the dead. The world behind the gate, is this? Charles's mind raced. He remembered watching the show years ago, bits and pieces still clinging to the edges of his memory. The rest was a blur, but certain words came back like sparks in the dark. Dragon eggs. White Walkers. The Wall. Ned Stark betrayed by his queen, conspiracies, incest, the fat one with the eyebrows. Who was that guy again? He muttered under his breath. The chubby one. Sam? Yeah, Sam something. His memories were fragmented, a messy collage of vague impressions, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary world. And Ned Stark didn't exactly have a bright future ahead of him. Charles felt a pang of regret. He hadn't known the man long, but there was something steadfast, even noble, about the old wolf, the kind of person you could trust when everything else was chaos. If there was anyone worth saving in this twisted, dangerous realm, it was him. But could he save him? Charles rubbed the back of his neck, frowning. He wasn't a hero, not by a long shot. The Red Keep was a fortress. Even if he knew the secret tunnels they'd escaped through, breaking back in would be suicide. Unless I had a squad of elite commandos, he muttered dryly. Yet, not happening. Still, the more he thought about it, the less impossible it seemed. If the gate could appear here, if this world was real, then maybe, just maybe, he could change what was meant to happen. The thought ignited something reckless in his chest. He pushed off from the table and strode toward the door. Where are you going? Arya asked, eyes narrowing suspiciously. To find a way to save your father, Charles said simply. She blinked, then shot upright so fast her chair tipped over. You have a plan? Her dull expression vanished, replaced by fiery determination. She threw on her boots, grabbed both her wooden practice sword and the thin blade she called needle, and hurried after him. I'm coming with you. Charles groaned. You'll only slow me down. Slow you down? I killed a stable boy once. Arya snapped, glaring up at him. Charles gave her a long, unimpressed look. Then maybe you should ask your father about my record. Also, a little respect wouldn't hurt. Your dad and I were of the same generation. Technically, you should be calling me uncle. Same generation? Arya scoffed. You look about Rob's age. I'm not stupid. Call me uncle, or you're not coming, Charles said coolly, folding his arms. You. He leaned against the door frame, smirking. Go on. The girl glared daggers at him, her grey eyes blazing with defiance. But in the end, under his maddeningly patient stare, she cracked. Uncle, she spat out the word like it burned. Charles chuckled. Good girl. She shoved past him, muttering curses under her breath, and stormed down the stairs. Smiling faintly, Charles followed. They stepped out of the inn together. The street was quiet, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops. Charles led the way confidently until, after a few steps, he stopped dead. Arya frowned. What's wrong now? He scratched his neck, embarrassed. You wouldn't happen to know how to get to the Dragon Gate, would you? Of course I do. Good. Then you lead, he said with visible relief. Time in this world was running short, and without her, he probably couldn't even tell north from south. Arya nodded, none the wiser, and motioned for him to follow. And so, under the fading orange sky, the odd pair set off together, a sharp-tongued tomboy and a displaced traveler from another world, toward the city walls and the beginning of a new, uncertain plan. Chapter 19, The Strange Man Named Jacqueline. Chapter 19, The Strange Man Named Jacqueline. That morning, a brutal scene unfolded at the Dragon Gate, on the northeastern edge of King's Landing. The Night's Watch recruiter, Yoren of the Black Brothers, was ambushed and hacked to death by a squad of gold cloaks. Several of the new recruits he'd gathered died with him, while the rest scattered in panic. Officially, the city guard claimed that Yoren had committed crimes in the capital and was executed on royal orders, but nobody really believed that. The common folk preferred the rumor that the new king, Joffrey Baratheon, simply hated the sight of black-cloaked crows. Others whispered darker, pettier tales, that Yoren had visited one of Littlefinger's brothels and refused to pay, or that he drunkenly mocked Varys, the eunuch spy master, and was struck down in secret revenge. Whatever the truth, the people of King's Landing were abuzz with gossip, and as usual, not a single one of them had the faintest idea what had really happened. No one outside the Red Keep knew that a group of high-profile prisoners had escaped from the dungeons that same night. The officials, of course, would never let such a truth slip. For a few copper coins, 10, to be exact, Charles managed to get directions from a chatty bystander to a grim courtyard at the edge of Flea Bottom. The man wrinkled his nose as they approached. Strangest thing, the gold cloaks didn't even bother to clear the bodies. Word is, the higher UPS ordered them left out here. No one knows why. He shrugged, pocketed his payment, and hurried off, eager to be away from the reek of blood and rot. Charles watched him go, then stepped into the courtyard. Arya followed a few paces behind, pinching her nose. Why are we here, anyway? What do you want with a pile of corpses? Charles smirked. If I told you some of them might not be entirely dead, would you believe me? She gave him a flat look. No. Fair enough. I'm not sure I believe it myself. He strode across the yard, toward a wrecked prison wagon half covered in dried blood and flies. Inside lay 3 bodies, crumpled together like discarded dolls. He'd spoken to these men briefly that morning before everything went to hell. The 2 at the top had been brutish, unfriendly types, the kind that glared more than they spoke. Charles hadn't bothered remembering their names. But the third one, the quiet one with the long, reddish-brown hair, that one had seemed different. And that was why he was here now. He crouched beside the wagon and peered through the slats. From a distance, it looked like the men had been skewered clean through, riddled with spear holes like honeycombs. But something didn't quite add up. Let's see. He muttered, grabbing a broken stick from the ground. With a grunt, he pushed aside the top 2 corpses, their bodies stiff and cold, until the long-haired man beneath was exposed. The face was pale but not drained of color, framed by tangled locks streaked with red and white. Hey, Charles called softly, poking him in the shoulder. You alive in there? No response. He frowned, leaning closer, and then, out of habit, activated the Eye of True Sight. This man has used a special technique to feign death. His blood still flows slowly, but steadily. Charles's lips curved. Well, look at that. He's faking it. Then, just to amuse himself and perhaps to test the act, he said aloud, a shame, really. He's dead. But those clothes look decent. Might fetch a few coins if I strip them off him. Arya wrinkled her nose. You can sell dead people's clothes. At least enough to buy you another jam tart, Charles said dryly. That did it. She grabbed her own stick and joined in, poking curiously at the dead man's tunic. See, she said with mock seriousness. If you take the boots, I'll take the belt. Charles chuckled. Deal. But be careful, or our corpse might. Before he could finish, a hand shot up fast as a viper and clamped around his wrist. The corpse opened his eyes, one grey-blue and one brown, glinting like steel in the sun. A low, accented voice murmured. "A man hears talk of theft, yet a man is not dead enough to be robbed." Arya yelped and stumbled back. Charles, however, just grinned. "Well," he said calmly, meeting those mismatched eyes. "Looks like the rumors were true after all." At first, there was no sign of life from the long-haired man in the cage, his stillness so perfect it could have fooled anyone. But when Charles and Arya tugged at his half-torn shirt to check for wounds, the corpse suddenly twitched, coughed twice, and drew in a ragged breath before lifting his head. Arya nearly jumped out of her skin. "He really came back to life," she exclaimed, eyes wide. Then she glanced at Charles, expecting one of his usual jokes, but for once, his face was serious. "Do you need us to get you out of there?" Charles asked calmly. The prisoner tilted his head, his mismatched eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. "A man has many friends, yet a man would not mind one or two more." His voice was smooth and strange, each word carefully weighed, spoken with an eerie rhythm. Then, as his gaze fixed on Charles, he added with quiet curiosity. "The boy's name is Constantine." Arya frowned. "Why does he talk so weird?" she whispered. Charles ignored her, his attention sharp. "You're Jacqueline, aren't you? Yoren said you were dangerous, that you once slipped into the Red Keep itself." Jacqueline said nothing, merely watched him with mild amusement, as if testing what kind of man stood before him. Charles took a steady breath. "You've been stuck in that cage for quite some time. That can't be pleasant. Help me with something, and I'll set you free." He wasn't completely confident about the offer. Once Jacqueline was loose, there would be no controlling him. But Charles didn't have other options, and if the man was anything like he'd been in the stories, then this gamble might actually pay off. He remembered now vaguely but clearly enough. Jacqueline wasn't Westerosi. He was from somewhere far across the sea, trained by assassins who could change their faces as easily as others changed clothes. A faceless man. In the tales, Arya had freed him from the same cage. And in return, Jacqueline had repaid that debt in blood. Maybe history could repeat itself. "A moment of kindness," Jacqueline murmured cryptically, "sometimes earns more than a lifetime of caution." He neither agreed nor refused. Charles narrowed his eyes. "If you're about to die anyway, all the rewards in the world won't matter." Then, more bluntly, "So will you help us or not? If not, we'll find another way. Maybe someone else will show up to save you. Or maybe the gold cloaks will come back to finish the job." He said it coldly, but his pulse was uneasy. Jacqueline wasn't someone to threaten lightly. Charles knew that, much magic or not, he was no match for an assassin who could kill kings without a sound. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other through the bars. Then Jacqueline gave a faint smile and nodded. "Very well," he said softly. "The boy speaks. A man will listen." Relief washed through Charles. "Good. Then here's what I want to know." He paused, then asked the kind of question that would have sounded insane to anyone else. "Can you kidnap the king?" Jacqueline blinked once. Then, almost politely, he replied, "That is the language of the Red God. But a man feels, the time is not yet right." Arya tugged at Charles's sleeve, whispering, "What does that even mean?" "It means," Charles said dryly, "he doesn't feel like dying today." He looked back at Jacqueline. "Fine. Then maybe something smaller. Can you get me a strand of the king's hair?" "Just one." "The golden hair of a false king," Jacqueline mused, curling his fingers through the bars. "Shining, precious, coveted by many. The boy wants it for a collection." "No," Charles replied, dead serious. "For a curse." At that, Jacqueline's eyes gleamed with faint amusement. "The boy is no man of Karth, nor of the Shadowlands. Charles didn't bother explaining. Instead, he picked up a nearby rock and slammed it down on the cage lock. It took a few hits, but the metal finally snapped with a sharp clang. The lock fell. The door creaked open. Jacqueline stepped out, stretching lazily like a cat freed from a crate. He looked from Charles to the grimy little girl beside him and tilted his head. After the third bell, he said quietly, "In Hook Alley at the cobbler's shop with the iron nails. A man will be there." Then, with unhurried grace, he straightened his torn clothes and disappeared down the alleyway without another word. Charles exhaled, finally relaxing. Arya stared after the departing figure. "So, getting Joffrey's hair will save my father." Charles shook his head. "Joffrey's hair won't. Then that red-haired weirdo will. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't." She frowned. "Then how are we going to save my father?" "You'll see soon enough." He looked down at her, his tone soft but firm. "Just pray your family's enemies don't rush his trial. I need at least one more day or there's nothing I can do." Arya blinked, not fully understanding. "So what do we do now?" "We wait," Charles said simply. "Wait? For him to bring back the hair?" "Exactly." He nodded, though in his mind, he added silently. "And wait for my time in this world to run out." Chapter 20, The Enemy of Thorns. Chapter 20 The Enemy of Thorns. How do you master a spell in just one day? For most people, the very idea would sound absurd, a fantasy within a fantasy. But for Charles, it wasn't impossible. He had something no one else did. The time gap between worlds. "If there really are gods up there," he murmured half-jokingly, "please let me learn this damned spell fast." Sitting at his desk, he worked with feverish concentration. His quill, deliberately dry of ink, danced silently over blank sheets of paper, sketching invisible lines, tracing invisible symbols. He was practicing. Using the fragmented memories left behind by his body's previous owner, he tried to reproduce the runes again and again, relying only on what he could recall and what he felt to be right. He dared not leave any visible traces. The church's eyes were everywhere. And though he was merely miming the strokes, without ink or focus, the results were far from ideal. Worse still, his reference was a half-faded memory of a messy notebook. But thankfully, he had an edge, the eye of truth. You attempt to inscribe a forbidden sigil, but your strokes are imprecise, failure. You attempt to inscribe a forbidden sigil, but your strokes are imprecise, failure. Proficiency plus 0.2%. You attempt to inscribe a forbidden sigil. Your accuracy improves slightly. You begin to grasp a subtle resonance. The floating text flickered across his vision again and again, small signs of progress that kept him going when exhaustion set in. The eye of true sight wasn't a weapon, nor even a proper spell, it was a lens, one that revealed knowledge, not power. And now, it was showing him something new, himself. Every correct movement, every minor adjustment, brought with it a strange, fleeting sensation, as if something deep inside him pulsed in recognition. It was subtle, easy to overlook. But the eye ensured he didn't. Every flicker, every whisper of progress, it recorded. There's nothing harder in the world, he thought wryly, than understanding yourself. When the sun finally rose, Charles set down the quill with a weary sigh. He looked out the window. The mist of dawn had lifted, sunlight spilled through the curtains, glinting off the rooftops of Pita City. Birds were singing. The world was painfully, mockingly alive. He tucked away the papers and quill, hiding them carefully. Then he stepped out into the hallway. The house was quiet. The door to Annie's room, the sickly, timid girl he was responsible for, remained firmly shut. She rarely left it unless coaxed. Downstairs, the new cook bustled about the kitchen, humming as she worked. Maggie, a stout middle-aged woman with kind eyes and rough hands, was a temporary hire, the best he could afford from a local housekeeping agency. "Breakfast will be ready soon, Mr. Cranston," she said cheerfully as he passed. Strawberry pie, honey-glazed bacon, warm bread, and fresh milk. Just make sure Annie eats, Charles said, pausing at the kitchen door. I'll be out for a while. Shall I save you a plate? No need. He grabbed his coat from the rack and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Maggie was a blessing, but also a drain. 3 gold crowns a month, affordable for a noble, ruinous for someone barely scraping by. If he didn't find new income soon, his pockets would run dry before the church reached its verdict. That was why he was heading out. After a half-hour's walk through the cobbled streets of Pisa, Charles reached St. Cy Cathedral, an imposing marble structure that dominated the skyline of the city's holy district. It was named after a long-dead priest, St. Cy, who'd supposedly saved the city from a plague centuries ago. The kind of myth the church loved to carve into stone and call history. Charles had already arranged a meeting the previous day. After a brief word with one of the attendants, he was guided to a quiet prayer hall inside. There, sitting alone on a pew in a shadowed corner, reading from a worn leather book, was Elliot, the man from the church who had escorted him before. The faint echo of Charles's footsteps was enough for Elliot to turn his head. His instincts were sharp as ever. "I hear you were looking for me," he said calmly. Charles nodded. "I was. I planned to sell that pile of dragon bones, figured you might know someone who'd be interested." Elliot closed his book, regarding him for a long moment. "You seem remarkably unconcerned." His tone hovered somewhere between bemusement and reproach. "Most men under investigation by the church can't even sleep, let alone make business deals." Charles shrugged. "Worrying about what I can't change won't help me. Might as well stay productive." Elliot studied him, expression unreadable. Then he said, "I don't need your bones, but I can introduce you to someone who does. However..." He paused. His blue eyes sharpened, voice lowering. "Even if you hadn't come looking for me, I would have come to find you." Charles frowned. "Why's that?" Elliot's answer dropped like a stone into still water. "Your verdict," he said quietly. "It's been delivered." Charles froze. His breath hitched. For the first time in days, his pulse quickened. Though Charles had been clinging to hope, convincing himself the church wouldn't really execute him, his heart still hammered as the moment of truth arrived. He couldn't help blurting, "So, no surprises, right?" Elliot gave a wry smile. "That depends on what you consider a surprise." Charles frowned. "You mean like, hanging, beheading, or maybe being burned alive?" The priest's expression didn't change. "You'd best go and see for yourself, instead of asking me." "Right." Charles drew in a deep breath, turned as if to leave, then hesitated and came back, scratching his head under Elliot's puzzled gaze. "Earlier," he asked, "you mentioned someone who might be interested in the dragon bones. Who exactly is that?" Elliot blinked. "You're still thinking about selling bones at a time like this?" Charles shrugged sheepishly. "I'm nervous. Trying to distract myself." He didn't get an answer. Instead, a silent acolyte led him through the echoing corridors of the cathedral, past pillars etched with angels and saints, until they stopped before a marble statue of the Holy Light. Kneeling before it was the same middle-aged priest who had tested him days earlier. Unlike ordinary worshippers, the man's prayer was eerie in its stillness, his eyes closed, lips unmoving, hands clasped so tightly they trembled. For a moment, Charles wondered if he'd fallen asleep. He waited quietly, not daring to interrupt. After a long while, the priest stirred, opening his eyes and turning toward Charles with a kindly smile that was almost too kind. "Busy lately?" he asked in a warm, casual tone, as though speaking to an old friend. Charles felt momentarily disarmed by the friendliness, but he quickly remembered his situation: suspect of heresy, not parishioner. "Just thinking," he said carefully, "about whether stories can really be changed." The priest tilted his head. "Stories? Are you a writer, then?" Charles chuckled weakly. Something like that. I get a bit too caught up in books sometimes. A hobby. I see. The priest nodded, motioning for him to sit beside him on a nearby bench. His expression turned thoughtful. We used a tracking spell on you, he said suddenly. Charles stiffened. And Elliot, who had followed them in and now leaned against a pillar, said nothing. The priest continued, smiling faintly. We found that, aside from hiring a cook, you've spent nearly all your time shut inside your home. At first, I found that suspicious, but now I understand. You were writing. He gave a soft laugh, his eyes gentle. A harmless pastime, even admirable. Thank you, Charles said, forcing a polite nod. He still couldn't relax. The man radiated warmth, but that only made him more dangerous. Sensing the tension, the priest sighed lightly and straightened his posture. The smile remained, but his gaze sharpened. All right, he said. Let's not waste time with pleasantries. You didn't come here for praise, and I suspect you already know why I summoned you. Charles swallowed. My verdict? Indeed. The priest's tone was calm, too calm. You are guilty, he said without hesitation. Possessing and attempting to study black magic grimoires is no trivial offense. The words hit hard, but the man's serene demeanor made it impossible to tell whether Charles should be afraid or relieved. Then the priest smiled again, that same unreadable, kindly smile. However, he continued, given your unique circumstances, the Church has chosen leniency. You will be given a chance to redeem yourself. Charles blinked. A chance? What kind of chance? The priest didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his robe and handed Charles a small, leather-bound book. The cover was old and scarred, the title etched in deep, curling script. Charles glanced down. 4 words, burned into the surface like a brand. The Enemy of Thorns. He looked up in confusion, but the priest merely folded his hands, that knowing smile still fixed in place. Chapter 21, Chapter 21 The Whisper of Thorns. Chapter 21 The Whisper of Thorns. The Enemy of Thorns Purification. Charles turned the slim white-covered booklet in his hands, his brow furrowing. Elliot glanced at him and gave a crooked smile. That one's the highest difficulty. How high are we talking? Charles asked warily. That depends entirely, Elliot replied, on what kind of person you are. For some, it's impossible. For others. He paused, a glint of amusement in his eyes. It might come naturally. Charles frowned. You mean, magic difficulty depends on the person? Elliot only smiled faintly. You'll understand soon enough. He handed the book back to Charles. How much time did Brother Worshie give you? A month. Not bad. Elliot folded his arms. The record for learning purification in all of Doolan Kingdom is 7 days. He said it casually, almost encouragingly, but the implication hit like a stone. Right, Charles muttered. Good luck, Elliot said with a faint smirk. That's exactly what Worshie said, Charles noted, voice tight. Which probably means it's extremely hard, isn't it? Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he handed Charles a small folded slip of paper. Take the bones, he said, and go to this address. Someone there will receive you. Ah, that matter. The sale. Charles took the note with a sigh, glancing down at the scribbled location. And what price should I ask? There'll be someone there to advise you. Elliot shrugged. Pete's a small city. A bad reputation spreads fast. No one will dare cheat you. Probably won't, you mean? Elliot smiled. No one can ever truly read another person. Charles exhaled, pocketed the note, and nodded his thanks before turning to leave. Elliot watched his figure disappear down the aisle, then quietly shook his head. Just as he turned to go, Brother Worshie the kindly, middle-aged priest who had presided over Charles's hearing stepped out from the shadows of a nearby column. "You shouldn't have let him mingle with practitioners so soon," the older man said softly. Eliot's tone was indifferent. "It hardly matters. He'll end up among them sooner or later. He may not even master purification." "Oh, I know." Eliot's lips twitched faintly. "But to avoid punishment, he'll have to try. And when the voice of Ulm rips his mind apart, he won't even remember the address I gave him." Worshie sighed. "He has talent but also a history steeped in forbidden arts. If he fails to master purification, then silence would indeed be the best mercy." He looked away, voice low and heavy. "The pirates of the Viper Sea are restless, the zealots of the Heart of Flame grow unstable, and the cult of demon apostles stirs again. I don't need another wild card slipping through the cracks. Without new blood, our order is collapsing, but reckless blood will only destroy us faster." He paused, then added grimly, "And his fall into darkness seems, very likely." "Why do you say that?" "The notebook's origin has been traced." Worshie's tone turned cold. "It belonged to Lady Cranston, his aunt. The youngest daughter of General Bourne of Doolin." Eliot's eyes narrowed. "She's supposed to be dead." "For some," Worshie murmured, "death isn't an ending." "Then why let that book reach Charles at all?" "Perhaps," the priest said, "someone meant to lure him to test whether he'd take the bait." Eliot scoffed quietly. "A recruitment ploy? Too crude. It feels more like someone wanted us to notice." "Whoever wanted it," Worshie said with that placid, unnerving gentleness of his, "the result is the same." He clasped his hands in prayer. "The kingdom's generals bring only chaos now. And chaos," he murmured, "is the soil in which evil takes root. May the Lord," he added, "purify them all." Sitting inside the rattling carriage, Charles turned another page of the thin white-bound book in his hands. Most of the contents were the same endless hymns, praises of the divine, and sanctimonious verses exalting something called the purification. Nothing useful. He exhaled sharply. Just a pile of holy nonsense. Rolling his eyes, Charles flipped back to the page that contained the actual spell, the incantation and its supposed method of invocation. "Should I try it?" He hesitated. Casting spells in the middle of a public street probably wasn't the brightest idea. But then again, this was a purification prayer, not some sinister necromantic ritual. What harm could it do? "Right," he muttered, "what's the worst that could happen?" He studied the words again, then gripped the silver-thorned cross pendant the priest had given him. Closing his eyes, he steadied his breathing and began to recite the incantation under his breath. At first, nothing happened. Then, halfway through the first line, a roar of voices erupted all around him. "Under the radiance of the holy light, all heresy shall be destroyed. God loves mankind, until mankind becomes corrupt. When all is evil, the Lord decrees, it must be purged. Crush the demon's crown, and you shall be delivered." Tens of thousands of voices shouted at once, booming, relentless, deafening. They weren't echoing from the outside world. They were inside his head, shouting directly into his skull. The onslaught hit him like a hammer. His vision swam, the world spun, his consciousness wavered. "You have been struck by an unknown will. Your memory has experienced minor deviation." The message flashed across his sight as Charles snapped back to awareness, gasping. "What the hell was that?" he croaked, clutching his temples. He hadn't even channeled anything, he'd merely spoken the words aloud. There had been no mana flow, no ritual focus. So how was that the actual casting effect? He muttered. "No, impossible. If simply reciting a prayer caused that, anyone could perform miracles." He frowned deeply, replaying the incident in his mind. Then it must require a specific condition. A qualification. Eliot's earlier warning echoed faintly in his head, the highest difficulty. Charles clenched his jaw. So that's what he meant. The spell itself fights back. Unlike the necromantic art of bone resurrection, this wasn't merely an arcane formula, this was something else entirely. Something that tested the soul itself. Holy spells, divine magic. He whispered. This might not even be the same category. He sighed, rubbing his temples, but curiosity gnawed at him. He glanced down at the enemy of thorns again. One more try. He took a deep breath, focused, and began to chant again. The result was immediate and worse. The moment he spoke the opening words, the roar returned, louder, closer, an avalanche of divine proclamations crashing straight through his consciousness. The air trembled. His ears rang. Covering them did nothing, the voices pierced straight through flesh and bone. You have been struck by an unknown will. Your memory has experienced minor deviation. The message blinked again as the noise finally receded, leaving only a pounding silence and the taste of metal in his mouth. Heart racing, Charles stared at the book in horror and slammed it shut. This spell is insane, he hissed. No one could possibly master it. Then he frowned. No, not even a ghost could. Still shaken, he recalled the strange message, memory deviation. What does that even mean? He muttered. He probed his thoughts, trying to detect any missing fragments, but everything seemed intact. His memories, his reasoning, his emotions, all normal. At least, he thought they were. Before he could dwell on it, the carriage slowed, and the driver's muffled voice came from outside. Sir, we've arrived 23 Martin Street. Charles blinked, glancing out the window at the modest building waiting ahead. Right, he murmured, tucking the cursed book deep into his coat pocket. Let's get this over with. Chapter 22, Chapter 22 Gold and Ink. Chapter 22 Gold and Ink. The shop was quiet, almost eerily so. Dozens of clocks filled the walls, their ticking gears and pendulums overlapping in hypnotic rhythm, creating a soft metallic symphony that filled the space like a mechanical lullaby. Ancient wormling bones, you say? At the back of the shop, an elderly man with silver grey hair and a clean-shaven, porcelain face leaned over the counter. A single monocle perched on his left eye as he carefully rotated a thin rib bone between his fingers, examining it as though it were a priceless relic. He turned it over several times, eyes narrowed, expression grave. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, shook his head, and looked up at the young man standing before him. A pity, he said. A juvenile specimen. Malformed at birth. Poor little beast, seems it had osteoporosis while it was alive. Charles blinked. Dragons can get osteoporosis. He was standing inside number 23 Martin Street, the address Elliot had given him. He had expected a clandestine guild hall, or perhaps a hidden black market bazaar, not a clock shop. Of course, as he soon learned, the store's facade was only a disguise. Behind the gears and glass faces, this place served as a meeting point for practitioners, the spellcasters and artificers of Peta City, a quiet hub for discreet trade and whispered exchange. Unfortunately, Charles was still an outsider. Without the church's sanction, he wasn't permitted to enter the inner chambers. Still, Elliot's note gave him the right to negotiate, and gold was a language everyone spoke. Dragon, the old man repeated, glancing again at the bone. Are you certain this came from a WIRM hatchling? Positive, Charles said without hesitation. The rest of the remains were a full, intact set. Unless some dog snuck in and swapped them out, there's no mistake. The old man nodded thoughtfully, then began rummaging through the counter. He retrieved several glass vials, a mortar and pestle, and a handful of dried herbs that he ground into powder. Mixing them together, he produced a dark blue liquid, which he carefully dripped onto the bone's surface. A faint sizzle followed. SSSHHH. Blue vapor rose like steam from a hot forge. The old man leaned forward, inhaling deeply, eyes fluttering shut as he analyzed the scent. After a moment, he straightened. Indeed, draconic traces fire breather type. But most of the dragon flame essence has already dissipated. He smacked his lips regretfully. If the resonance were stronger, I could have doubled the price. Charles raised an eyebrow. So what's it worth now? The man scratched his chin, considering. £1 for 10 sovereigns. Fair enough. Charles did some quick mental math. £1 roughly half a kilo. 10 gold sovereigns about the same as a tenth of a countryside estate. In simpler terms, one bone could pay his new cook's 3 months of wages. And the pile on the table weighed at least 20 pounds. He couldn't tell if the offer was fair or not, but for something he'd practically dug out of a pile of corpses, it was more than generous. I'll take it, he said. The old man nodded, brisk and businesslike. 27 pounds, 15 guises. Let's call it 28 even. He ducked behind the counter, metal clinking and coins jingling. After a moment, he returned and slid a heavy leather pouch across the table. There you go. Count it if you like. Charles did carefully. He wasn't foolish enough to take even a respectable merchant at his word. When he finally tied the pouch shut, the weight in his hand made him exhale with relief. 10 years of wages, neatly packed in gold. Elliot's lead had been worth it. He tucked the pouch away and looked up. Do you have anything here that I could actually use? The old man lifted his gaze, studying him closely. You, he said, stroking his chin. Strictly speaking, you're not one of us. Normally, I wouldn't sell to outsiders. But... He smirked faintly. If the church sent you, then perhaps this isn't a normal circumstance. He turned, pacing toward the shelves stacked with odd trinkets, glass vials, rune stones, sealed books, and jars filled with glowing dust. Let me think. He murmured. Maybe I do have something for you. The old clockmaker tapped his fingers on the counter, thinking. Then, with a faint grunt, he disappeared into the back room. Charles waited, listening to the layered ticking of the clocks around him, hundreds of tiny gears marking time like 100 patient hearts. Moments later, the old man returned, carrying several thick, dust-covered books. This one's the Tragedy of Arcavia, he said, stacking them neatly on the counter. This is Carroll's 13 Principles of Spellcraft, and this one, he tapped the cover of a dark crimson tome, The Devil Belongs in Hell. He pushed the books toward Charles with a knowing look. These should be enough to get you started. The deeper theories won't help you yet. You'd only burn your fingers trying to grasp what you're not ready for. Charles accepted the stack with both hands, eyes flickering across the embossed covers. The intricate sigils and arcane illustrations stirred something inside him: excitement, curiosity, the hunger of someone who had been fumbling in the dark and just found a lamp. He'd already learned to cast spells, yes, but without any understanding of why they worked. Until now, he'd been no better than a blindfolded child playing with matches. This, though, this was knowledge. How much? He asked. 13 gold sovereigns, said the old man, his tone flat but his smile faintly amused. Thank you for your business. Dash. When Charles stepped back into the sunlit street, the weight of the books under his arm felt strangely reassuring. His hired carriage was still waiting across the road, the driver lazily dozing with the reins in hand. Charles climbed in and opened the book titled Carroll's 13 Principles of Spellcraft. He'd barely gotten through the introduction before something outside the window caught his eye: a signboard across the street. Stop the carriage, he said suddenly. I almost forgot something. The driver nodded without complaint. The fee was by the hour, and idle time was still billable. Charles left the books on the seat, stepped down, and crossed the street. Dash. The building before him was a narrow 4-story structure of dark wood, weathered but sturdy, its balconies sealed with aging glass. It looked much like every other aging townhouse in the district, except for the sign that hung crookedly by the door. Little Imp Detective Agency. Private investigators weren't exactly common in this era, and a licensed office was even rarer. Despite its worn appearance, the place carried an air of competence. Pushing open the door, Charles found a young woman seated inside, sipping tea behind a modest desk. She looked up as the bell chimed. "Apologies for the intrusion," Charles said politely. "Do you take investigation requests here?" Business was clearly scarce. Her eyes lit up immediately. She set down her teacup and stood. "Of course. Please, have a seat. What kind of investigation do you need? Your services are confidential, I assume?" Charles asked first, his tone even. "You won't share your client's information?" "Absolutely," the woman said, pouring him a cup of tea. "Discretion is the foundation of our trade." Charles nodded his thanks and took a small sip before leaning forward. "I'd like you to look into recent events in Kenyon Town, outside the city, both major and minor. And specifically," he paused, "I want everything you can find on Lady Rhine, former mistress of Black Maple Fort." He hesitated briefly, then added, "Oh, and one more thing. There's a bald, middle-aged constable here in Peta City. I'd like his file as well." The woman blinked at the oddly specific list but quickly composed herself, scribbling notes in neat, cursive strokes. "No problem," she said, eyes glinting with professional focus. "We'll deliver a full report within the week." Charles nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. I'll pay extra for speed and silence." As he turned to leave, the soft ticking of distant clocks echoed in his mind again, a reminder that in this world, time itself was the most valuable currency of all. Chapter 23, Chapter 23 To speak is to cast. Chapter 23 To speak is to cast. To demons, cruelty is not a sin but a virtue. The foundation upon which their existence thrives. Thus, any mortal who dares summon or worship such entities will inevitably be crushed beneath the full weight of human order and divine retribution. The Book of Penitence warns us well. Those who revere the culture of demons never meet a good end. Unless, of course, they still possess some use. Closing the book titled "The Devil Belongs in Hell," Charles exhaled softly, eyes lingering on the page as if the ink itself still whispered to him. A week had passed since he sold the dragon bones. In that time, he'd done little else besides secretly practicing the strange sigils of the Curse of Agony and studying the 3 books he'd bought from the clockmaker's hidden shop. The Tragedy of Arcavia. The Devil Belongs in Hell. Carroll's 13 Principles of Spellcraft. By now, he'd devoured them cover to cover, and what he'd learned had changed his entire understanding of the world he was living in. This wasn't merely a land of nobles and castles. This was a world with gods, with spirits, with demons, with the dead, and with monsters that walked between reality and nightmare. Ordinary citizens might have dismissed such tales as superstition, but Charles, or rather, the noble-born body he now inhabited, had grown up close enough to power to know that these things were very real. That was why the body's original owner had been so eager to experiment with forbidden magic. He'd wanted to rise above mediocrity to join the true elite, who wielded real power. The result, of course, had been catastrophic. But that failure had also paved the way for Charles's arrival, and the fragments of the original's life, combined with his own strange afterlife experience as a wandering soul, had given him enough clues to start piecing things together. He had once believed this was a typical sword and sorcery world, one where mages channeled arcane energy, warriors trained their battle auras, and the devout invoked miracles of faith. He couldn't have been more wrong. Yes, this world was steeped in mystery. But mana didn't exist here. Neither did battle aura, or divine grace. Magic, he learned, wasn't about power. It was about communication. The book Carroll's 13 Principles of Spellcraft described it in deliberately vague terms, but the essence was there. To understand why you are you, and not something else, that is the first key to the spiritual realm. In this world, the so-called spirit or essence wasn't an energy source like mana. It was spiritual awareness, intuition, inspiration, and soul. It was the clarity that came from perceiving the world and oneself beyond the surface. Only those who had awakened this inner awareness could ever perform magic. Charles didn't quite understand the philosophy of it, but as he experimented following the book's vague exercises for spiritual perception, he'd realized something startling. He had already activated his spirit. Somehow, without knowing it, he'd done what the body's previous owner never could. That was why the original had failed to cast spells, and why Charles had succeeded almost effortlessly. But that revelation raised another question, one that gnawed at him the more he thought about it. If the previous owner couldn't awaken his spirit, then how did his body end up binding mine? Coincidence? Charles murmured. Then his lips curled in skepticism. No, I don't believe in coincidence. His gaze drifted toward the desk drawer, where his missing black notebook should have been. If everything started from that book, then it must contain answers. But that investigation would have to wait. For now, his focus was on understanding the art of spellcraft. If communication itself is the foundation of magic, he muttered, tracing the air with his finger, then what if a master negotiator were born into this world? Wouldn't he be a terrifying spellcaster? It wasn't an idle thought. Because in Arcavia, to cast a spell is to communicate. You speak not to yourself, not to the air, but to something beyond. The stronger your spirit, the clearer your conversation with the unseen, and the more powerful your spell. The incantation isn't the source of power. It's merely the bridge, a linguistic construct that translates your intent into a form the world can understand. Ordinary language carries no weight. You can recite 100 syllables, but they'll be nothing more than sound. Only when those words are transformed, filtered through one's awakened spirit into the mysterious language of essence, can they resonate with reality. That, Charles realized, was why the spells he'd tried during his prison escape had behaved so inconsistently. The language of essence wasn't universal. It was shaped by the language of the caster. Each person's spiritual resonance was unique, which meant that every incantation sounded and worked differently. If your words didn't reach the other side, the world simply wouldn't listen. He leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. So, spellcasting is just divine diplomacy. He couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it, and yet, the logic felt flawless. Looks like, he said, half to himself, I've been negotiating with the universe all along. In other words, when a spell written in the Doran tongue was translated into the language of spirit, the beings from beyond the gate, those long-dead natives of that other world, simply couldn't understand it. If they couldn't comprehend his words, they couldn't respond, and without a response, no spell could ever take form. So that means, Charles murmured, flipping through the dense notes from the 13 Principles of Spellcraft. To perform a sacrificial ritual, you first have to learn the language of the entity you're offering the sacrifice to, then negotiate, bargain, or plead until it agrees to respond. He frowned deeper. And for elemental magic, the communication happens with the world's own elements: wind, fire, water, earth, commanding them through resonance. The logic seemed sound, but something about it refused to settle. What kind of conversation could possibly persuade mindless forces of nature to organize themselves into a spell? Do I give a speech? Hold a debate? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. And if language comprehension matters this much, how come the elements in the Game of Thrones world understood me perfectly when I used spells there? Shouldn't communication barriers exist between worlds too? He let out a slow sigh, his thoughts looping into a spiral of questions. And if communication alone can shape magic, he muttered, glancing at the pages covered in sigils, then why do these strange symbols even exist at all? The more he learned, the less he understood. Maybe I've been thinking about this the wrong way. Unfortunately, the clockmaker had been clear: those 3 books were only the foundation. Anything deeper than that, he would have to discover on his own. He turned another page, eyes falling on a line about necromancy. So the spell Bone Resurrection isn't part of the infernal category after all, it's a branch of death magic. Then what's the difference between death and hell, he wondered aloud, staring blankly at the parchment in front of him. No answer came. Just more questions. Eventually, Charles gave up chasing theories and began tidying the mess on his desk. He stacked his notes, capped his ink, and forced his mind to empty itself in preparation for his next journey. As he swept a loose page aside, the title "The Thorn's Enemy" caught his eye, the church's so-called purification spellbook. He froze for a moment, grimacing. He'd tried practicing the spell a few times over the past week. After all, the church still watched him closely, and pretending to cooperate was safer than defiance. But every attempt ended the same way, with pain, dizziness, and an overwhelming surge of alien noise in his head. Once, he'd tried to push through it. He'd nearly blacked out. After that, the nightmares began, visions of radiant crusaders burning demons, sermons echoing in his sleep, their voices dripping with piety and judgment until it felt as though his very thoughts were being washed clean. It wasn't just training. It was indoctrination. It was as if the spell itself refused to function unless he believed. Unless his heart aligned with the church's faith, the power would never accept him. So that's how they do it, he muttered bitterly. Without a pure, righteous soul, no ordinary person could ever master their miracles. And those who did, inevitably became the very thing the church wanted: holy, obedient, unquestioning. He couldn't decide if that was genius or horrifying. Either way, it explained something crucial. The church might be rigid, even fanatical, but it was never corrupt. Its hierarchy filtered itself. Only the faithful could ascend. High-minded zealots, Charles murmured. But not liars. At least, not in the parts he could see. Despite how maddening his official sentence had been, it came with a few quiet benefits. The city watch stopped harassing him. The shadow that once loomed over the Cranston family conspiracy vanished without a trace. He'd paid off the rest of his debts, the cost of the books, the private investigator's retainer, and still had more than 200 gold sovereigns left in savings. He'd hired a full household staff, a cleaning maid, a cook, a kitchen hand, a general maid, and most importantly, a butler. Counting food, upkeep, and maintenance, the monthly cost came to about 20 gold, comfortable enough for a young noble in exile. At least I won't starve anytime soon, he mused. Though castle maintenance will bleed me dry eventually. His mind drifted briefly to his territory, the estate that once belonged to his family. The detective's report hadn't arrived yet, but he'd already begun preparing for whatever came next. Because more pressing than finances or politics, was the gate. The portal had been silent since his return, but as he looked down, the familiar lines of information shimmered across his vision like a system message written on glass. Name, Charles Cranston. Age, 16. Condition, healthy. Skills acquired. Eye of true sight, passive. Bone resurrection, 6%. Curse of agony, 0%. Dimensional gate recharged, 243.11.24.01. Charles smiled faintly, heart quickening with anticipation. Looks like it's ready again, he whispered. Time to see what waits on the other side. Chapter 24, Chapter 24, A Straw Doll for Salvation. Chapter 24, A Straw Doll for Salvation. Laid neatly across the desk were a few simple materials: a sewing needle, bundles of straw, a strip of linen, a pair of buttons, and a single strand of hair. Aria's grey eyes blinked furiously as she looked between them, her small hands fidgeting. "Are you sure I can do this?" she asked, voice uncertain. "I'm sure," Charles replied absently from across the room. "I've never made one before," she muttered. "I can't even embroider flowers properly. How am I supposed to make a doll?" "Embroidery and sewing aren't the same thing," he said, glancing back at her over his shoulder. And if you've done one, you can handle the other. You've learned to sew, haven't you? Septa Mordain said my needlework was worse than Hodder's, Arya mumbled. Hodder. Charles frowned. Who's that? The big guy who only says Hodder. So, an idiot. He's not an idiot. Arya snapped, then hesitated. He's just slow. Then he's an idiot, Charles muttered under his breath. Out loud, he said with mock reassurance, if even he can do it, then you definitely can. He's not an idiot. Arya said again, though she finally started sewing, her small fingers awkwardly pushing the needle through the fabric. But promise me one thing when it's done, you can't laugh at it. I'll probably make something uglier myself, Charles said, distracted. So I've got no right to laugh. You say that, but Rob used to laugh at me every time. Even Sansa, she started, rambling on as her hands worked. Their conversation wandered from one subject to another, filling the little inn room with a strange sort of warmth, or at least, the illusion of it. Because beneath the chatter, both of them carried heavy hearts. For Arya, her father's capture loomed over everything. For Charles, uncertainty gnawed at him about the spell, about time, about the fragile thread on which their plan depended. The curse of agony wasn't truly a curse, not in the traditional sense. It was closer to a form of sympathetic sorcery, the art of crafting a vessel to inflict harm from afar. A straw doll. A voodoo effigy. To make it work, you needed something that carried a trace of your target's essence, a personal object, bound to them for long enough to retain their spirit imprint. Hair was best. But once removed from the body, its energy began to fade, completely useless after 24 hours. In short, if Jaqen managed to obtain Joffrey's hair, they'd only have one day to act. If Ned Stark's trial didn't happen within that window, their plan would crumble. Unless they somehow got another strand. Why do you want to save my father, anyway? Arya asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Did he save your life? Charles didn't look up from his parchment as he drew the sigils. Hard to say. Maybe I saved him. Maybe he helped me. Who knows? Then. I only know him here, Charles interrupted. And besides, I need my notebook back. He said it lightly, but his focus never wavered as his quill danced across the page. In truth, it wasn't just about Ned Stark. He wanted to see if he could change the story to prove that fate here wasn't fixed. He'd already broken Ned out of prison once, only to watch him get recaptured the next day. Maybe that was coincidence. Or maybe the world itself was correcting him. If this world followed a written script, was someone or something watching? And what would happen to an outsider who tried to rewrite it? Either way, he wasn't about to stop now. He wasn't reckless, just unwilling to let go of the one thing that might link him to real power, the notebook. The church's purification magic couldn't help him. He wasn't a believer, and that spell required faith he didn't have, and couldn't fake. The only path left was through forbidden magic, black magic. And since the church hadn't noticed his necromancy practice, what harm could one more experiment do? You done yet? Arya asked, holding up her crooked little doll. I think mine's finished. Almost there, Charles muttered, still sketching runes. Do you really think your spell will work? She pressed, frowning. You'd better pray that it does, he said dryly. She swallowed, nerves fluttering in her chest. Charles wasn't exactly calm himself. He'd practiced the glyphs, the chants, the process, but never actually cast the spell. If it worked, it could save Ned Stark. If it failed, well, he wasn't sure what would happen. Still, once the symbols began to take shape, thick lines of black ink forming strange geometric curls, his hesitation faded. Dozens of sigils now covered the paper, glimmering faintly like something alive. Arya, wide-eyed, hovered beside him, breath caught in her throat. When Charles finally set his pen down, he noticed her staring. "What are you looking at? Go finish your part." "I am finished." She grinned faintly and held up the doll again. "See?" He blinked. "That's hideous. I've never made one before. Even Sansa couldn't make a prettier one." Arya huffed, crossing her arms. Charles smirked. "Doesn't matter. We're not here to win an art contest." He took the ragged doll from her, wrapped it in the rune-covered paper, and tied it tight with a piece of string. Then, closing his eyes, he steadied his breath and began the invocation. "Spirit births all things. Spirit ends all things. Spirit binds all things. By the essence of Charles Cranston. I call upon the mother of all, and request her." He abruptly stopped mid-sentence and turned to glare at Arya. "Could you not stare at me like that?" "Why?" she asked innocently. "Because," he said gravely, "a sorcerer's spell fails if someone watches him. It's bad luck." Arya blinked, suspicious. "Really?" Charles's tone didn't waver. "Absolutely." She sighed and turned around, though not before whispering, "You just don't want me to see you mess up." Charles smirked faintly, hiding his nerves behind the sound of his own heartbeat as the last of the runes began to shimmer like dying embers. Charles actually felt a strange, inexplicable nervousness tightening in his throat, a subtle kind of stage fright. Of course, that was the kind of thing he'd never admit aloud. "Strange wizard," Arya muttered under her breath, disappointed. Then, deciding not to interrupt him any further, she ran to the corner of the room, grabbed a grey blanket, and pulled it over herself like a tent. Only when she disappeared beneath the makeshift cocoon did Charles finally relax. He drew in a deep breath and began again, his voice low and measured. "Spirit gives life to all things. Spirit returns all things. Spirit extinguishes all things. By the essence of Charles Cranston. I call upon the mother of all. To build a bridge between souls. Bind the spirit of Craig to this effigy. Thus I seal the curse." A few seconds passed. Nothing. The air felt still, expectant. Then the faint shimmer of true sight flickered before his eyes. "You have attempted to activate Curse of Agony. Casting failed." The straw doll lay motionless on the table, tied tightly in its linen wrappings, utterly unchanged. Charles frowned but wasn't surprised. Every spell had its rhythm, and this one would likely take several tries. Under the blanket, Arya was listening closely, ears perked up like a cat's. She heard the pause, but remembering his earlier warning, she didn't dare peek. Then came the chant again. The same words. The same rhythm. Arya frowned. "I don't remember wizards ever saying their spells twice," she whispered to herself. In old Nan's stories, there were witches, green seers, and the children of the forest, but no wizards. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. The chanting continued, the same phrases again and again. Soon, she'd memorized every word of it. And just as she was about to drift into boredom, something changed. The voice. The tone. The sound of the chant shifted, twisting into something alien and hollow. It no longer sounded human. It was like the wailing of ghosts echoing through stone halls, like the sighing wind in an abandoned castle corridor, mournful, endless, and cold. The sound seeped through the room, crawling beneath Arya's blanket and into her bones. Her heartbeat quickened, a rush of icy fear coursing through her veins. She could almost feel something behind her, creeping closer. Then, mercifully, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Unable to stand it any longer, Arya forgot every warning Charles had given. She threw off the blanket and turned toward him. And froze. On the desk, the parchment that had been covered in black runes, the same one wrapped around her hand-stitched doll, was burning. Not with fire she could see, but with a strange, invisible heat. The paper curled and blackened, edges folding inward as if consumed by an unseen flame. But the runes didn't burn away. Instead, they lifted from the page, glowing faintly in the air, twisting, merging, alive. The black marks coiled together, linking into a single chain, dark, metallic, and glimmering like iron forged in shadow. The chain writhed like a serpent, winding around the fat little straw doll before sinking into it completely. When it was over, the doll looked different. Its pale linen skin was now edged with delicate black lines, as though stitched over with hair-thin thread. Arya swallowed hard. Is it supposed to do that? Charles leaned back, catching his breath. A small smile touched his lips. I'd say that's a good sign. His true sight had already confirmed it. You have successfully cast Curse of Agony. It worked, he murmured. So this will save my father? Arya asked hopefully. He shook his head. No. This one's just a test. Her eyes brightened with a mix of fear and excitement. Test. Exactly, Charles said, already standing up. And we have the perfect candidate, that annoying fat innkeeper. It was poetic, in a way. The man's hair had been the perfect practice material collected by Arya herself under Charles's direction. She'd done well, and he'd been impressed by her stealth. Now, it was time to see if her hard work would pay off. Dash. But the moment they opened the door, someone was already waiting for them in the hallway, a tall, unsettling figure with hair half white, half red. Arya jumped back, nearly dropping the doll. Charles blinked, then exhaled in relief. You're early. I thought we were meeting at the cobbler's shop. Someone changed his mind, Jaqen Hagar said with a faint smile. Charles sighed, rubbing his forehead. You could have sent a message. The man tilted his head. Someone also failed to bring what was promised. Charles froze. His stomach dropped. Did he? Before he could respond, Jaqen continued in that same calm, melodic tone. But someone else, a certain golden-haired queen mother, has the most beautiful curls in all the 7 kingdoms. Surely, they will do just as well. Charles blinked, then broke into a slow, incredulous smile. Cersei's hair, he muttered. That might actually work. Dash. Chapter 25, Chapter 25, Joffrey the Wise. Chapter 25, Joffrey the Wise. Inside the royal apartments of Maegor's Holdfast, sunlight poured through tall windows, glimmering across golden drapes and polished marble floors. Every inch of the room spoke of excess, and at its center stood the young king himself, Joffrey Baratheon, preening before a full-length mirror gifted by a merchant from Lys. 2 handmaids scurried around him, tightening belts, brushing shoulders, and adjusting every wrinkle with terrified precision. The young king, crowned with a glittering golden antler circlet that caught the light against his shining blonde hair, wore a crimson robe trimmed in silver, cut neatly at the knee to show off his refined figure. Below, he sported immaculate black trousers and tall boots threaded with gold. To complete his ensemble, Joffrey had chosen a fire-red silk cloak edged in black, embroidered with a leaping stag and roaring lion, symbols of both his heritage and his vanity. The result was dazzling, perhaps even garish, but Joffrey admired himself with open delight. He grinned at his reflection, tilting his chin upward. Yes, he murmured. Majestic. Truly, they shall see their king today. But the moment he descended the staircase, his pride was met not with praise but with his mother's frown. Kings should look dignified and commanding, said Cersei Lannister, her emerald eyes narrowing. You look like a boy playing dress-up. What? This is magnificent. Joffrey brushed his sleeve with mock grace. I think it suits me perfectly. If I were you, she said, exhaling, I'd use what little time we have and change into something proper. The young king's smile faltered. He straightened his shoulders and replied sharply. You're not me. I'm the king. I wear what I please. I'm your mother, Cersei reminded coolly. Joffrey turned, lips curling. The king's mother. A heavy silence hung between them. For a long moment, they simply stared, Cersei unflinching, Joffrey fidgeting beneath her gaze. Then, with forced nonchalance, he turned to the armored knight at his side. "Good dog," he said cheerfully. "My attire suits a king, doesn't it?" The hound, his face hidden behind a snarling metal helm, replied dryly, "You're the king." Satisfied, Joffrey cast his mother a triumphant smirk. Cersei sighed. She had no patience for another argument. "Fine," she said at last. "A king must have his freedom. Perhaps this isn't worth quarreling over." Her tone softened slightly, but her eyes sharpened again. "Just remember there must be no mistakes today. When Eddard Stark confesses, you'll strip him of his titles and lands, send him to the Night's Watch, and forbid him from ever meddling in the realm again. Do you remember your lines?" "Of course," Joffrey said proudly. Grand Maester Pycelle called it his masterpiece. "Though honestly, I think I might shorten it a bit. Too wordy." Cersei rolled her eyes, but said nothing more. They left the chamber together, followed by a retinue of armoured guards. Dash! The royal carriage rolled out of Magur's Holdfast, descending the winding roads toward the Great September of Baelor, where the trial of Lord Eddard Stark was about to take place. Another carriage trailed behind. Inside the barred wagon sat Eddard Stark, head shaved, beard gone, his weathered face gaunt and shadowed. He leaned against the wooden bars, silent and unreadable. From his window, Joffrey caught sight of him and sneered. "He looks like a clown," the young king scoffed. "A crippled old fool who thought he could flee King's Landing. What a pathetic show." "Fools are amusing," Cersei said quietly, "but it would be wise to ask how he escaped at all." Her tone darkened, her expression thoughtful. "Sir Meryn examined every corpse. The young man who helped Stark, the one you mentioned, was never found. Perhaps we should hire a skilled painter to sketch his likeness and post a bounty." She paused, then added, "And that notebook you spoke of, the strange one. Even if it contains no sorcery, its material alone is remarkable. A parchment so thin and soft, unlike anything known in Westeros." At that, Joffrey perked up, eyes glinting with curiosity. "And the maesters? Have they made progress?" "None," Cersei admitted. "It's written in a script no one can read." Joffrey scowled. "Then what good are maesters if they can't even read a book? Pycelle's ancient. He made me wait once before council. A king. Waiting." He clenched his fist. "We should replace him." "You already dismissed Sir Barristan," Cersei reminded pointedly. "Replacing the Grand Maester right after that would be unwise. I'm the king. My word is law. A wise king listens to counsel," she said calmly. "And a real king has his own mind," Joffrey shot back. "Father never listened to any of you. That's why he's dead." "That was an accident. One mistake is all it takes to die," she said coldly. "I warned him and you saw what happened." "I said it was an accident," Joffrey snapped, voice rising until even the guards outside heard him. None dared react. Silence filled the carriage again. Finally, Joffrey muttered, eyes downcast, "I don't even like wine." "Good," Cersei said, softening. "Drink only when politics demand it, and even then, sparingly. Oh, and another thing, stop striking your betrothed. Even the gods despise such acts." "I've never hit Sansa," Joffrey lied smoothly, and looked away. Dash. By the time their carriage arrived at the Great September of Baelor, Joffrey's irritation had nearly vanished. The deafening cheers of the gathered crowd filled him with energy again. He stepped out, one hand resting on the jeweled hilt of his sword, and climbed the marble stairs. Tens of thousands of eyes followed him. He felt invincible. "Look at them," he murmured, smiling. "Their king." Standing at the platform's center, he waved grandly to the masses, but when he turned, he saw his mother whispering quietly to Sansa Stark, her red hair gleaming in the sun. Joffrey's smile faltered. "That whore," he hissed under his breath, rubbing his still bruised elbow. Dash. The plaza below was packed a dark sea of heads and restless murmurs that buzzed like a swarm of flies. Then the crowd parted. Eddard Stark was dragged up the steps, flanked by armored guards. He kept his head bowed, gaunt and silent, enduring the jeers and stones hurled from the crowd. On the platform, he paused. The sunlight gleamed off his shaven head. "I am Eddard Stark," he said quietly, voice steady. "Lord of Winterfell, and former hand of the king." A hush rippled through the crowd. Even the nobles leaned forward. "I stand before gods and men to confess my crimes." His voice strengthened. "I betrayed my king, my friend, Robert Baratheon. I betrayed his trust and his command." He paused, breath unsteady. "I swore to protect his children, yet while his body was still warm, I conspired to depose and murder his son to claim the throne myself." Gasps and shouts rippled through the crowd, then anger took hold. "Traitor! Kill him! Death to the wolf!" Rocks began to fly, guards raised shields as the mob howled for blood. At Cersei's subtle gesture, the High Septon stepped forward to continue the ritual. He knelt before the king and his mother, booming in a solemn tone. "Before gods and men, this man has confessed his sins. The gods are just, but they are also merciful. Your Grace, what is your judgment?" The mob roared again, a single, unrelenting chant. "Kill him! Kill him! Kill him!" The cries lit a feverish gleam in Joffrey's eyes. His hand tightened on the sword. For the first time, he felt its true power. This was his moment. His first act of rule. His chance to show them all. Mother's words echoed dimly in his mind, send him to the wall. But then came the cheers, the chants, the memory of that day Sansa's wolf had humiliated him, and the sight of Ned Stark's cold, defiant eyes. His jaw tightened. "I am the king," he thought fiercely. "And a king must answer his people." He raised his hand. "My mother and Lady Sansa begged for mercy," he announced. "But mercy is for the weak." He turned, smiling cruelly at Sansa's pale face. "A traitor deserves but one reward." Joffrey lifted his hand, pointing toward the executioner. "Sir Ilyn," he declared, voice sharp as steel. "Bring me his head." A stunned silence, then a deafening roar of approval. Sir Ilyn Payne stepped forward, expressionless beneath his black hood. He drew his massive greatsword, ice, from its scabbard, Ned Stark's own blade, and raised it high. The crowd screamed for blood. Joffrey grinned, trembling with exhilaration. But before the blade could fall, a voice cut through the chaos loud and clear. "Stop! Or I'll kill the queen!" Gasps rippled through the mob. There, atop the marble statue of Baelor the Blessed, stood a young man, wind whipping at his cloak. In his hand, he held a crude straw doll, a mockery of a man. For the first time, the great square fell utterly silent. Cersei's scream pierced the air. Sir Ilyn froze mid-swing. And Joffrey the Wise King blinked in disbelief. Chapter 26, Chapter 26, a threat in broad daylight. Chapter 26, a threat in broad daylight. "Stop! Or I'll kill the queen." The voice was loud, hoarse, and cracked with fury, echoing from atop the statue of Baelor the Blessed. Everyone in the square looked up, but all they could see were the man's black trousers and worn brown boots. His face was hidden from view. "Kill the queen! Who's that lunatic? Get down from there!" The crowd jeered, brushing off the words as madness. The executioner glanced up briefly, unimpressed, and prepared to resume his duty. At the same time, a unit of gold cloaks pushed through the panicked masses, spears raised, their commander barking orders. Then the man atop the statue gritted his teeth, clutched the twisted rag doll in his hand, and pinched. "Ah!" A scream split the air. Heads turned. And then they froze. It was the queen herself. Cersei's hands clutched her flawless face as she shrieked in agony, raw, human, and utterly terrified. The queen! Your Grace, what's happening? The executioner stopped cold. Even the young king and council stared in shock. The hoarse voice rang out again from above. See that? That was just her face. Keep testing me, and next time it'll be her head. A wave of silence rippled through the crowd. Then someone shouted. Witchcraft! Run! He's a sorcerer! A black magician! Mother, I'm scared! Get away from him, death is in the air! Panic exploded. The square descended into chaos, people trampling one another in blind terror. Charles stood high above, unmoved, his sharp eyes sweeping the scene below. He had no interest in the frightened mob, his focus was fixed entirely on the platform. There, nobles and knights alike were staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and dread. After a long pause, Grand Maester Pycelle lifted his trembling gaze and croaked, threatening the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms is, most unwise, stranger. Charles didn't bother replying. He simply pinched the doll's leg. A scream tore from Cersei's throat, sharper, more hysterical than before. That was his answer. The pain was invisible, but real enough to make even a lioness whimper. Whatever magic this was, it terrified everyone who witnessed it. What do you want? Cersei gasped through clenched teeth, her voice quivering between rage and fear. Finally, Charles exhaled softly, feigning calm. Too many people here, he said lightly. Crowds make me nervous. Who knows if one of them's a would-be assassin? You might want to clear them out before we continue. In truth, his nerves were taut. He hadn't known the exact timing of Ned Stark's sentencing. The moment the bells rang, he had sprinted for the square. He had expected to arrive early, to position himself for a clean rescue. But by the time he reached the site, the plaza was packed, the crowd swelling by the minute. Pushed and jostled from all sides, Charles had barely managed to squeeze his way forward until he found himself at the base of the great statue. There was no room for hesitation. While the crowd held its breath under the watchful eye of the High Septon, he climbed the statue, doll in hand. The timing had been razor thin. Had he waited any longer, Ned's head might have rolled. Now, though, the plan was in motion and he couldn't afford to falter. The gold cloaks, unnerved by what they'd just witnessed, obeyed without question. Under their captain's barked commands, they began driving the citizens away from the statue. The terrified townsfolk fled at once, forming a wide ring of empty space around the monument. No one dared come closer. Still, none could look away, not from the stranger who dared defy the throne itself. We've done as you asked, Pycelle stammered. Now, may we know what you demand? Charles's tone turned cool, steady. Release Eddard Stark. Prepare a ship in Blackwater Bay, crew shackled, a chest of gold on board, and my notebook. Do that, and no one dies. Forgive us, sorcerer, the maester quavered. We're not sure what notebook. Enough. The interruption didn't come from Charles this time, but from the young, golden-haired king himself. A king does not yield to threats. Joffrey's voice cracked with fury. Put away your filthy tricks, or I'll see your head on a spike. Charles rolled his eyes. I already look good. I don't need your approval. He squeezed the doll again. Cersei's agonized scream cut through the air. Joffrey's face flushed scarlet. You bastard! I'll kill you! I'll flay your family alive, send the men to the brothels, I'll make the whores of King's Landing take turns with. His words turned to incoherent howling. For all his golden hair and royal title, he looked less like a king and more like a spoiled, sputtering street brat. Charles smirked faintly. Careful, little lion. Next time, I might use you as the doll and make the crowd watch while I crush your precious jewels. Why you? Joffrey's voice rose to a shriek. Kill him! Kill that cur! I want his head on the walls now! But before the gold cloaks could move, a deep, gravelly voice rumbled from behind him. Hold! The hound, tall, broad, helmet shaped like a snarling dog, stepped forward. He looked up at Charles, then turned his glare toward the knights beside him. "Stand down." Silence fell again. No one argued. Even Joffrey, pale with fury, could only clutch his throbbing hand after punching the hound's armor and howl in pain. Joffrey's face twitched with fury, his voice trembling with rage. "Good dog? Go cut off his head right now. I want it hanging on the city walls. Good dog." "I'm sorry, Your Majesty." "You damned mutt!" Joffrey spun around and again threw a punch at the tall knight beside him, only to yelp in pain when his fist met solid steel armor. The humiliation only made him angrier. Ignoring the towering knight, he drew the sword from his waist with a hiss, his teeth clenched in a snarl, and stormed down the platform toward the great September of Baelor. "Sir Ilyn! Bring the men! Come with me! Shove! No, stop!" Cersei's desperate cry echoed across the plaza, but her son ignored her completely. He charged down the steps like a maddened beast, only for his world to abruptly go dark. Pain lanced through his neck, and everything faded to black as he collapsed. "Do as he ordered," came a low, muffled voice, rough and cold. It was the hound. The tall knight in the dog-faced helm turned, glaring sharply at Sir Ilyn Payne, who had just pulled off his executioner's hood. The look was part warning, part command. The platform fell silent. The great and powerful of King's Landing exchanged uneasy glances, none daring to speak. At last, under Queen Cersei's trembling command, they moved. Grand Maester Pycelle, shaking like a leaf, ordered his attendants to fetch his notes from the Red Keep. Tyrion stood frozen, expression unreadable, while servants released their grip on the kneeling, bald-headed Eddard Stark. Sansa, tears glistening in her eyes, suddenly broke free. Her red hair flashed in the sunlight as she lifted her skirts and ran toward her father. Some knights moved to stop her, but the hound stepped in front of them. "Do you want the Queen Mother hurt again?" he growled. That one line froze everyone. No one dared to move further. Charles watched the unfolding chaos in silence. He didn't say a word, but the puppet in his hand drew every eye. No one knew who this man truly was, nor why the doll in his grasp carried such strange, terrifying power. But the fact that Queen Cersei had inexplicably collapsed moments ago was undeniable proof enough. No one wanted to provoke him. No one dared to get close. And so, amidst that dreadful tension, a scene destined to echo through the ages quietly etched itself into memory. Gold, ledgers, a ship, and crew, everything was prepared in record time. Under heavy escort, Charles and his companions were ushered through the square, along the bustling streets, and down to the docks. There, waiting for them, Arya's eyes lit up with disbelief and relief as she saw them arrive. In the end, the bewildered Stark family stood aboard a ship with black sails, staring at the confused, fearful gold cloaks shrinking below. The ship drifted steadily away, and the harbour of King's Landing became nothing more than a fading black speck on the horizon. That day, a mysterious sorcerer, before the eyes of nobles and commoners alike, threatened the monarch of the Seven Kingdoms, rescued Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and extorted a chest of gold from the crown. Though the royal court would later do everything in its power to suppress the story, no decree could silence the thousands of mouths that had witnessed it. Ravens took flight across Westeros. And the Seven Kingdoms trembled. End of chapter. Chapter 27, Chapter 27, The Shifting Balance. Chapter 27, The Shifting Balance. Old Town, Citadel of the Maesters. In a dimly lit chamber filled with the faint scent of melted wax, a single candle flickered on a polished oak table. A young acolyte in a grey robe stood respectfully beside an aged archmaester, his beard streaked with white, a heavy chain resting against his chest quietly reporting the latest intelligence. "Lord Stannis Baratheon of Dragonstone remains elusive," the acolyte began. "We tried contacting Maester Cresson, but his replies were vague. Rumor has it a red-robed woman has arrived on the island. He seems cautious about the matter. The old man's brow furrowed. The acolyte continued. Prince Doran of Dorne is still observing the chaos in King's Landing from afar. He's shown no signs of intervention. However, the Martell family has begun recruiting hedge wizards from the countryside, apparently quite intrigued by recent events. Renly Baratheon is doing much the same. He's just left Storm's End, planning to rally troops from the Stormlands while watching the situation unfold in the capital. But after that incident, he seems in no rush to move. As for Casterly Rock, it's locked in fierce battle with the north. Ravens can barely slip past their archers, but some estimate that the war will soon halt altogether once they hear the news. The acolyte hesitated, then frowned. Are wizards truly that powerful, Archmaester? There have been mages meddling in Westerosi politics before, but never with such impact. The old man shook his head. This is different. Those so-called wizards of old could never threaten, let alone influence a king. That's why they were dismissed as charlatans. But this black sorcerer managed it. The acolyte still looked unconvinced. His role as an information gatherer across the Seven Kingdoms made him skeptical of anything that smelled of superstition. And yet, every raven that reached the citadel told the same story: the entire realm was shaken by one mysterious man. Believe what you will, the Archmaester said softly. But consider this: Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, is not easily swayed. He's a cautious man. His restraint alone could change the outcome of this war. The acolyte nodded uncertainly, not entirely grasping the connection between the Stark Lord's prudence and the sudden pause in the fighting. Still, he pressed on. Maester Marwyn has already departed for the north upon hearing the news. The old man sighed, not in anger, but in weary acceptance. Perhaps that's for the best. Marwyn is the only one among us who truly studies the arcane. If anyone can uncover this black sorcerer's nature and intent, it's him. Anything else? Nothing further, Archmaester. Then you may go. The acolyte bowed and left. Alone, the Archmaester turned toward the corner of the room, where a silver candelabrum held a slender, crystalline cylinder, the fabled glass candle. Its surface shimmered faintly, though it was unlit. Mystery upon mystery. He murmured. The glass candle sleeps, so why has magic awakened? King's Landing. Elsewhere in the capital, the atmosphere was just as tense. Our dear king is throwing a fit in the Magur's holdfast, whispered a tall, thin man to a rotund, bald companion. He's shattered several antique vases from Aegon's era, stabbed 2 serving girls, and even slapped the Grand Maester. Oh, the old fool deserved that, the bald man lisped in his peculiar sing-song tone. But what was the reason, I wonder? The reason, the thin one replied, unfazed by his master's mannerisms, was the notebook. You can guess his grace is livid about losing face before the realm. But more than that, he's obsessed with what dark secrets might have been written in it. The bald man tilted his head, eyes glinting. And the Queen Mother? She's locked herself inside Magur's tower. Some say she's frightened. Personally, I think the incident reminded her of unpleasant memories. Unpleasant? The bald man feigned ignorance. Something about a forest witch, my lord. You know the tale. It left quite a mark on her as a child. Ah, yes, if only Sir Jaime were here we might have been treated to another romantic tragedy in armor. The bald man sighed dramatically. And the hound? He fled after knocking out the king. Pity. The hound truly was fond of little Jove, though the boy never returned it. Both men chuckled softly, though beneath the bald man's smile flickered a shadow of concern. A king without soldiers, he murmured, and a mother who commands the lion's share of the realm's power. If the queen were to fall ill, Lord Tywin would not be merciful. His companion smirked. After all, the queen has more than one son. The bald man's smile deepened, but his eyes turned cold. And now, a sorcerer enters the game. At sea. Thank you all for your hard work. Once we reach Dragonstone, I'll see you well rewarded, said Eddard Stark, his limp more noticeable on the uneven deck. He stood before the crew, his expression stern but his tone lighter than it had been in King's Landing. Since escaping the capital, he hadn't rested for a moment organizing routes, encouraging sailors, and ensuring no Lannister spies remained aboard. Though he was no politician, Eddard Stark was ever the cautious man. "No thanks needed, my lord," said the ship's captain with a nervous grin. "It's an honor to carry you and your family." Even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward a young figure standing quietly at the stern. Charles, gazing out over the black waters beneath the moonlight. The captain quickly looked away, unease flickering in his gaze. With a sorcerer powerful enough to crush a man into a doll with his bare hands aboard their ship, not a single sailor dared to slack off. The fear of invoking the wrath of the Black Wizard kept them working in nervous silence, every rope pulled tighter, every command followed instantly. Eddard noticed their fear, though he said nothing. After all, these men were not his own bannermen, their loyalty was bought, not earned. Instead of reassurance, he merely gave a few curt reminders to stay vigilant, then limped toward the bow of the ship where a young man leaned casually against the railing, the sea wind tossing his dark hair. Eddard's expression was grave as he approached. "We can't afford to let our guard down," he said. "You may hold her life in your hand, and that keeps the Queen at bay for now. But she has many enemies, Charles. You're one of them." Charles glanced at him sideways, a faint smile curling on his lips. "Oh? And you're not?" "I." Eddard hesitated, the truth flickering briefly in his eyes before he looked away. "Let's change the subject. Tell me, can your doll really kill a man?" Charles chuckled, his tone unreadable. "Would you believe me if I said it couldn't?" "Perhaps," Eddard replied stiffly, "but I would never take that risk." "Neither would the Lannisters," Charles murmured, his gaze drifting back to the dark waves below. The spell he'd used wasn't truly lethal, it was called the Curse of Agony, not Curse of Death. All it did was inflict unbearable pain for a brief time, its power limited by both distance and duration. Had his enemies shown more courage, or had that reckless boy king not panicked, the rescue mission might have ended in disaster instead of triumph. In truth, the entire realm had been deceived. But that secret would die with him. Terror came not from strength, but from mystery, and Charles understood that better than anyone. After a long silence, Eddard spoke again, voice heavy with sincerity. "Thank you. You saved my life, again." Charles tilted his head slightly, distracted, eyes following the churning water below. "And how do you plan to repay me for that? What is it you want?" He shrugged lazily. "Hard to say. I'm not much interested in titles, lordships mean little to me. You don't strike me as particularly wealthy either, and I've already got a chest full of gold. As for your daughters, one's too plain, the other's too naive. I'll pass." Eddard frowned. He'd never considered his daughters as bargaining chips, but still couldn't help defending them. Arya may lack grace, but Sansa is not a fool. Charles smirked. "We have a saying for that kind of girl. We call her the third fool because she's not just a fool, she's one worse than the second." The foreign jest went over Eddard's head. In Westeros, Sansa's name bore no such meaning. Yet recalling his eldest daughter's behavior in King's Landing, he found no argument strong enough to deny it. Then Charles spoke again softly, almost carelessly, but his words struck the Lord of Winterfell like a hammer. "How about this?" he said. "What if I helped you fight your war?" Eddard blinked, stunned. For a long moment, he could only stare, unable to tell whether the young man was joking or offering to change the fate of the North itself. End of chapter. Chapter 28, Chapter 28 Voyage to Dragonstone. Chapter 28 Voyage to Dragonstone. Once they had left the waters of King's Landing behind, the murky tides of Blackwater Bay gradually turned clear and deep. The rough wind, a long, sleek galley, sliced through the waves with surprising speed under the strained effort of its uneasy crew. But Eddard Stark knew forced loyalty never lasted long. He was cautious by nature, always had been, and so rather than steering north toward the familiar harbors of White Harbor or the Fingers, he ordered the ship toward the mouth of the bay, to the island fortress of Dragonstone. "I had meant to tell Robert the truth," Eddard said, his voice low, the sea breeze whipping at his cloak. "That none of the Queen's children were his by blood. But before I could, he was dead. You can be sure that was her doing. The Lannister Queen's venom runs deep." Anger flashed briefly across his face, quickly fading to a look of weary regret. "With no true-born heirs, the throne by right should pass to Stannis. Dragonstone is his seat and it lies close enough to the capital. If we're fortunate, we can reach him before word of this spreads too far." Charles smirked faintly. "To discuss how best to seize that stinking city back, I assume." "Perhaps," Eddard admitted. "Though after what I said on the steps of the September, I fear my words now carry little weight." He shook his head, the memory still stinging. Though his confession had been forced, wrung from him by threats to his daughters, it did little to ease the shame of it. "You weren't truly guilty," Charles began, his tone careless. "Coerced confessions hardly count as—" The sound of light footsteps interrupted him. Turning, he saw a young girl approach, her auburn hair shimmering in the sea air. "Father," she said, curtsying gracefully. Then she turned to Charles and dipped her head. "Sir Cranston. Sansa Stark, daughter of the Lord of Winterfell. Estimated age, 13-15. A faint whisper of information flickered in Charles's mind as he took her in. Her long chestnut hair gleamed like polished copper, and her clear blue eyes shone with quiet curiosity like the waters beneath the ship. Graceful, refined, and strikingly beautiful, she was every inch the noble maiden she was raised to be. Charles thought she looked quite different from the version in his memories of the show, though the details had blurred over time. Best, he decided, to accept this new reality rather than chase ghosts of another world. Sansa was undeniably beautiful. But her rigid posture and perfectly measured tone grated on him. He found more comfort in conversation with her younger sister, Arya the tomboy with a sharp tongue and fearless eyes. Unfortunately, Arya's relief after their escape from King's Landing had left her bedridden with a fever. She was still confined to her cabin, muttering in half-sleep. "If you've come to thank me again, don't bother," Charles said lazily, leaning against the railing. "Your father's already done that." His tone was flippant, his posture utterly unknightly. There was none of the solemn dignity expected of a noble warrior. He looked more like a vagabond bard enjoying the sea breeze. Still, his good looks and easy charm kept the comparison flattering. Were he plain-faced or poorly dressed, people might have called him a scoundrel instead of a free spirit. After 2 days at sea, everyone aboard had grown used to his irreverence. Even Eddard, for all his adherence to formality, had learned to tolerate it. Charles had offhandedly claimed it was a noble tradition where he came from, which had only deepened the northern lord's quiet confusion. What kind of nobles, he wondered, behaved like that? "No, I only came out for some fresh air," Sansa replied softly. Her smile was gentle, almost radiant. "The sailors say we'll reach Dragonstone soon." It was clear she was delighted to be free of King's Landing. Her face had been all smiles since leaving port, though every time she looked at Charles, her expression turned a mix of gratitude and awe, hinting at the suffocating fear she'd endured in the capital. Eddard's voice broke her reverie. "We may have to stay there for a night or two," he said sternly. "See that you take care of your sister. Perhaps we should ask Dragonstone's maester to look after her." "Maester Cresson is old," Eddard replied, frowning. "I'm not certain he still practices medicine." "Maybe the Citadel has sent a new one," Sansa offered hopefully. Her father gave no answer. As they spoke, the fog over the horizon began to thin, revealing the faint silhouette of an island. It wasn't large. A fishing village huddled by the shore beside a narrow harbour, and beyond that rose a mountain of dark stone that seemed almost black against the grey sky. Halfway up its slope stood a fortress unlike any other, a vast stronghold crowned with towers shaped like dragons' spines and wings. Even from afar, Dragonstone exuded an ancient, haunting majesty. Its towers were jagged, its walls the color of obsidian, its silhouette like a sleeping beast guarding the sea. Compared to the Red Keep of King's Landing, it felt older, prouder, alive. The rough wind surged forward, oars churning the waves in perfect rhythm. The rowers strained harder as if treasure or destiny itself waited for them ahead. There was no treasure waiting at the end of their voyage, only a promise. Eddard Stark had assured the sailors that once they reached Dragonstone, they'd be released with a generous payment for their trouble. Thus, when the shadowy outline of the island finally appeared over the horizon, the men bent their backs with feverish urgency. What should have been a half-day's journey took barely 3 hours. Under the direction of the harbour master, the rough wind pulled neatly into the dock. Gangplanks were lowered, and one by one, passengers and crew descended carrying crates, chests, and sacks of provisions. To their surprise, a group was already waiting at the pier. They weren't soldiers, but officials, middle-aged and older men, immaculately dressed, their faces lined with authority. They stood in neat formation, all surrounding a man at the front, broad-shouldered, rigid-backed, with a short-cropped beard that only made his expression look sterner. He looked like a sculpture chiseled from stone, cold, immovable, utterly humorless. A bald-headed statue, Charles thought privately. As Eddard limped forward, the man gave no greeting, no movement, only a steady, piercing stare. It seemed he wanted to speak but restrained himself. Eddard opened his mouth first, but before he could utter a word, a manic shout broke the tense silence. Fog! All fog! Deeper than the sea! Can't see, oh, he's dead! He's dead! A jester-like man, round-bellied and dressed in garish colors, screamed hysterically from the crowd. The atmosphere shattered instantly. The bald man's eyelid twitched, his face remained stone, but his gaze slid toward a weary knight beside him. The knight, grey-bearded and dressed simply, gave a stiff nod, turned, and dragged the shrieking fool away by the collar. A pale young girl, her expression caught between fear and pity, scurried after them. The disruption ended as quickly as it began, like a pebble dropped in still water, ripples fading into calm. No one commented on it. Eddard turned back toward the grim figure who had yet to say a word. Their eyes met briefly before Eddard bowed his head. "Your Grace, Stannis." At that, several of the men surrounding the dock smiled faintly in greeting. But the bald man, Lord Stannis Baratheon, did not. His expression remained ironclad as his cold voice cut through the sea breeze. "You confessed before all of King's Landing that Joffrey Baratheon is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne," he said. "Why, then, do you still call me king?" The remark was as sharp as a blade, and several of those present exchanged uneasy glances. A handsome man with long golden hair stepped forward hastily. "Your Grace, that confession was made under duress. Lord Stark spoke those words to save his daughter's life. I wasn't speaking to you." Stannis's eyes flashed, and the man flinched, bowing his head in silence. Eddard's voice was steady when he replied, humble and heavy with guilt. "As Warden of the North, I failed in my honor. I beg your pardon, Your Grace." The stiffness in Stannis's face softened by a fraction, though only a fraction. "You wear humility well," he said dryly. "When you and Robert drank and laughed in the capital, I was still rotting here eating rats in this god's-forsaken place." As he spoke, his eyes drifted to Charles, who was watching him with open curiosity. Stannis narrowed his eyes. "And I see you staring. I've not much hair to admire, boy." The tension shifted immediately toward the young stranger. Dozens of gazes turned on Charles, some curious, some wary, others openly hostile. Among the crowd, a sharp-faced woman with large ears and a severe expression stepped forward, her tone venomous. "Heretics have no place on this island," she snapped. Dragonstone shall not harbor servants of dark gods. Her words hung cold in the sea air. Stannis didn't even flinch. He turned to her, irritation flashing briefly in his eyes. "My lady is tired," he said curtly. "See that she's taken to her chambers to rest." The woman's face twisted in anger, but she dared not protest further. Servants quickly led her away. Stannis then turned back toward Charles, his tone calm but distant, unreadable. His gaze flicked briefly toward another figure standing at his side, a tall woman draped in flowing crimson robes, her red hair gleaming like fire. "Lady Melisandre," Stannis said evenly. "Our guest is a man of unusual gifts. See that he's treated well." At his command, murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion, disbelief, even fear. Charles met Melisandre's eyes and smiled faintly. Her expression did not change, but the air between them felt charged, as if two storms had just crossed paths. The wind howled through the harbour, and above them, the towers of Dragonstone loomed like the claws of a slumbering beast. The Black Sorcerer had arrived. Chapter 29, Chapter 29 The Sealed Notebook. Chapter 29 The Sealed Notebook. She may be a priestess. Her status on this island is complicated. Estimated age, between 25 and 35. Her entire body radiates an unknown energy. She bears mild hostility toward you. Her hair was a deep copper red, cascading like molten metal in the torchlight. Her eyes, two gleaming rubies, shone with an inner fire, their warmth laced with something fluid, almost hypnotic. Around her slender neck hung a scarlet gem that pulsed faintly in rhythm with her heartbeat, completing the image of a woman both divine and dangerous. Her lips curved faintly, and her smile was as polished as her face, heart-shaped, flawless, seductive. Beneath the folds of her crimson robe, her figure was graceful yet powerful, as though sculpted with sin in mind. This was Melisandre, the Red Woman of Dragonstone. Around 30, by appearance at least. She had the beauty of a ripe peach, radiant, intoxicating, and dangerous to touch. But the first thing she said to Charles made her beauty feel more like venom. "I advised His Grace to have you shot with 1,000 arrows before you ever set foot on this island." Her tone was calm, her lips still curved in an almost serene smile. Charles blinked. "I don't believe we've met before." She was stunning, so much so that it was distracting, but if his memory of the world's lore was right, wasn't she supposed to be far older than she looked? Melisandre tilted her head, her smile never fading. "You walk in shadow," she said softly. "The darkness clings to your soul, yet you act in the name of justice. The flames showed me, not evil, but a fog, a veil of mystery." "So," Charles asked with a half-smile, "you decided not to kill me?" "No," she said simply, "His Grace refused." Her crimson eyes glimmered as she studied him. "No mortal can cast such a curse without sacrifice. Tell me, what price did you pay?" Charles thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Nearly shouted my throat raw. Does that count?" Melisandre gave no answer. She merely looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, then turned and walked away without another word. "What the hell was that?" Charles muttered, baffled. The corridor around him was quiet again. He glanced around, carved stone walls, flickering torches, and far below, through a narrow archway, the faint outlines of the harbour and the men unloading supplies. He sighed. "Now how do I get out of here?" Before he could turn back, a servant girl appeared, curtsying politely. "My lord, the lady, our divine lady, has instructed me to show you to your chambers." "Divine lady?" Charles echoed. "Lady Melisandre," the girl replied with reverent awe. "She is the true God's chosen messenger. We call her that among ourselves." Charles rolled his eyes, losing all interest in conversation. The girl was pretty enough, freckles on her nose, a soft youthful face, but the moment she started preaching, he mentally checked out. "You people ever have normal conversations here?" he muttered under his breath as they walked. Dragonstone was as bleak as its ruler. Stannis, stiff and humorless as a plank of iron. His wife a shrill zealot with wild eyes. And that fool in the harbour with a bucket on his head? Charles didn't even want to think about it. And Melisandre the walking flame cultist was the cherry on top of this madhouse. The young maid led him through winding stone corridors and across a cold courtyard to a modest room on the castle's third level. It was small but clean, with twin windows that opened to a breathtaking view of the sea. Charles stretched his arms, breathing in the salt air. After weeks of chaos, the thought of a bed that didn't move with the tide felt heavenly. Eddard and his family would be fine, he was sure of it. Whatever tense exchange had occurred at the harbour, Charles recognized it for what it was, two solemn men measuring pride and power, trying not to step on each other's honor. He collapsed backward onto the bed. So, what now? Glancing at the countdown hovering faintly in his vision, he noted he had roughly 5 days left before the portal recharged. No sense wasting time. He pulled a worn leather-bound notebook from inside his boot, the same one he'd hidden since King's Landing. On the ship, he'd spent every spare moment poring over its pages. But without the proper tools or materials, he'd been unable to test anything beyond memorizing the incantations. Besides the 2 spells he'd already mastered, 4 more were recorded within. Whispers of the Dead. Evil Eye of Malice. Touch of Fatigue. Blood for Blood. All necromantic in nature, and all requiring corpses. He exhaled, closing his eyes briefly. Yet, try explaining that to the locals. Still, he couldn't bring himself to abandon it. These grim arts were all he had, the only real power at his disposal. The so-called purification magic of the church had been a farce, a leash disguised as faith. His eyes flicked toward the window, where the last crimson streaks of sunset bled across the sea. Then again, he muttered, that red woman clearly knows her magic. He frowned suddenly. Wait, how the hell did that bald bastard know I used hair for the doll spell? The waves outside crashed violently against the cliffs, as if echoing his unease. Charles turned past the section describing the 4 necromantic spells, his eyes settling on the latter half of the notebook pages darkened with age and the faint scent of ash. 3 new titles greeted him. Phantom's Veil. Tongue of Oaths. Wraith Substitute. At first glance, they appeared similar to the previous spells, grim and steeped in death. Yet unlike the earlier incantations, these 3 required not bodies, but souls. Spiritual Essence. Soul Fire. The lingering fragments of the dead. Whatever one chose to call it, all 3 demanded vast quantities of it. There were no shortcuts. No substitutes. Only the harvest of spirits could fuel these forbidden arts. Even among necromancers, such spells were rarely practiced, their difficulty and cost were far beyond reason. A normal sorcerer could live an entire lifetime without ever using them. But Charles couldn't afford to ignore them. These 3 spells were more than tools, they were protection. The very key to hiding his identity as a black magician in a world where the church burned heretics by the dozen. He continued reading. The next section appeared to be written in a different hand, its tone reverent yet weary. Before the carnival of the necromancers, our numbers had dwindled to fewer than 100. It was not until Lady Phyllis devised the 3 false spirits that our order survived the church's purge. We must forever remember her name and those who followed her path. Charles exhaled slowly. So that was it. This Lady Phyllis had created the trio of forgery spells designed not to destroy, but to conceal. To let necromancers walk among the living unrecognized by the divine light. Phantom's Veil cloaked the caster's aura, allowing them to appear holy and radiant under spells of detection. Tongue of Oaths severed the binding force of divine vows, freeing the user from the consequences of lies and broken promises. And Wraith Substitute, the most unsettling of all, created a spectral double that would absorb punishment meant for the caster when even oaths failed to protect them. As Charles traced the ink with his fingertips, a slow grin tugged at his lips. If I can master these 3, he murmured, I'll never have to worry about being exposed again. He already possessed a strange, inexplicable immunity, something that made divine detection overlook his use of dark magic, but he didn't trust it. Whatever power protected him might vanish as suddenly as it came. Which meant learning these spells wasn't just useful. It was necessary. In truth, that was part of why he'd agreed to join Eddard Stark's coming war. The battlefield would provide more than opportunity, it would provide souls. "Shame I can't get started yet," he muttered, flipping to the final pages. They were blank, or so it seemed. Every so often, however, faint black letters would rise from the parchment like bloated corpses surfacing in dark water. The words would shimmer in and out of existence, twisting across the page before sinking again into the paper's depths. He could never read them fast enough. It was as though something unseen dragged them back down, sealing them away beneath an invisible barrier. It reminded him of fish breaching the surface for air, or perhaps a curse that refused to be unveiled. Charles frowned, drumming his fingers on the leather cover. "What the hell are you hiding?" he whispered. The silence of the stone room offered no answer. Only the rhythmic crash of waves against Dragonstone's cliffs echoed faintly through the window. Whatever secret these pages held, it was buried deep, sealed tight by a power he could neither name nor break. But one thing was certain. He would find a way to unseal it. Chapter 30, Chapter 30 Light in the Dark Night. Chapter 30 Light in the Dark Night. Eddard's party had remained on Dragonstone far longer than Charles expected. Perhaps it was because they were deep in discussion about how to reclaim King's Landing. Or perhaps it was because Arya's illness still hadn't improved. Though, if Charles were being honest, he suspected a third possibility, that old Eddard might have been quietly detained. Still, every so often he'd catch a glimpse of Sansa Stark's bright auburn hair in the courtyard, laughing and playing with a pale-skinned girl whose face was marked by faint grey scales. Judging by their expressions, the two houses didn't seem to be at odds. If Arya's condition were truly worsening, there was no way Sansa would be smiling like that. Unfortunately, Charles couldn't check for himself. His freedom on the island was limited. Not exactly imprisoned, but Dragonstone was enormous, a labyrinth of cold stone corridors and echoing halls. With no idea where anything was, and with servants speaking to him only when delivering meals, it felt like a comfortable sort of confinement. At first, he suspected this was Melisandre's doing. But later, he overheard a pair of maids whispering that it was actually Lady Celis, Stannis's wife, the big-eared madwoman, as Charles privately called her, who had warned the servants not to approach the sinister sorcerer with demonic tricks. Charles had just snorted and muttered under his breath. "No wonder your husband's about as passionate as a block of ice." Still, he didn't mind. Peace and solitude had their uses. He took the time to rest, memorize more of the notebook's incantations, and plan how to actually begin practicing when the time was right. The days passed in quiet rhythm, and with just over 3 left before he could return to his original world, Charles found himself oddly unhurried. Nothing much happened, or rather, almost nothing. Because one night, when he stepped out onto the balcony, he noticed something strange in the heavens. The deep navy sky, once flawless and speckled with stars, now bore a single scar of crimson. It was like a wound slashed across the firmament, a streak of blood tearing through the velvet dark. The tip of it burned a deep red, fading gradually into pink, as if the very color were bleeding away into the void. A comet! A red comet! The servants were buzzing with speculation, whispering in the corridors and praying at their altars. But Charles recognized it immediately. He just didn't know why it was here or what it meant. This was a world where magic and prophecy were as real as the air itself. Was this a celestial event, a natural movement of the heavens, or the omen of something darker, something summoned? Its arrival was silent, too sudden. One evening the sky was clear, and the next morning the crimson tail hung high above Dragonstone like a bleeding flame. Some said it was King Robert's spirit, weeping from the heavens over his false heirs. Others claimed it was a divine sign, proof that Stannis Baratheon's war to overthrow the false king was righteous. The sword of vengeance, the sailors whispered. The dragon's tail star, sweeping clean the sins of the world. And wasn't it fitting, they said, that it should appear above Dragonstone, the ancestral home of the Targaryens, the dragon lords themselves? Surely it was a sign that Stannis' new reign would be blessed by fate. Charles, overhearing this while passing through the corridors, could only stare blankly and mutter, "Sure. Or maybe it's just me accidentally breaking the weather again." Some servants even whispered that the red comet was the work of his black magic. That one earned only a long, tired sigh. Yet, he thought dryly, staring up at the burning streak across the night sky. Everything weird in this world's apparently my fault now. If he really had the power to summon comets, Charles thought dryly, he wouldn't still be sitting here doing nothing. Pretty sure that wasn't in the show, he muttered, leaning on the windowsill and staring up at the starry sky, the red comet still glowing faintly above the dark horizon. Then again, it made sense. His memory of the world's plot was fragmented at best, and details like cosmic phenomena had never been the focus. But still, something felt off. Since awakening his spiritual sense, his perception of the world had sharpened dramatically. To him, reality no longer felt like mere air and matter, it had texture, depth, weight. In the past, this world had seemed like a wall of stone, solid, coarse, and alien compared to the one beyond the gate. Now, though, that wall was changing. Bit by bit, it was being polished, refined. "This world is shifting," he whispered. As the thought settled, a sudden spark of realization flickered in his mind. Wait, this place doesn't have the Holy Church, or their damned thorned cross. If I tried the purification spell here, would those restrictions still apply? It was a dangerous thought. A tempting one. The Church's magic had always been more curse than blessing, binding him, forcing ideology into his mind with every incantation. But here, in a world without their gods or faith, would it still twist his thoughts the same way? He hadn't dared to test it before. Between the chaos in King's Landing, the escape, and the new spells from his notebook, the purification ritual had long been buried at the back of his mind. But now, 3 days from returning through the gate, he found himself staring into the night, wondering, should he try? Just the memory of the last attempt made his throat tighten. The noise, the whispers, the dreams that followed had been unbearable. Still, he wasn't one to shy away from a little danger. "It's not like it'll kill me," he muttered. Without further thought, he unclasped the silver cross pendant hanging from his neck and aimed it at a gargoyle perched on the castle wall below. He drew a breath and began to chant. "In the name of the servant of the divine Charles Cranston, I call upon the light that is ever present." He paused. Not because of the booming voices that had once overwhelmed him, but because this time they didn't come. The words flowed effortlessly. No echoing choir. No suffocating pressure. Just silence. A thrilled grin crept across his face. He started again, more firmly. "In the name of the servant of the divine Charles Cranston, I summon the omnipresent light. Crush. Burn. Cleanse. Purify. So long as evil endures, this prayer shall not end." The air trembled. Then came the sound, majestic and resonant, not the shriek of madness he'd heard before, but something holy. His voice deepened, layered upon itself until it filled the room, reverberating like the tolling of cathedral bells. A surge of brilliance answered his call. Threads of light pierced the night from all directions, weaving together above him like silver rivers. Weak yet unwavering, they gathered toward his hand, toward the small silver cross clenched between his fingers. The glow stung his skin with faint heat, a tingling pain that quickly softened into warmth, gentle, cleansing warmth. And then the cross transformed. The light solidified into shape, expanding and spinning before him. A radiant cross of pure white flared into being, trailing a streaking tail like a comet, his own tiny reflection of the one above. It shot downward in a single burst, embedding itself against the gargoyle's stone forehead. The creature was bathed in light. The cross burned brighter, drawing in more and more of the same faint luminescence from the shadows around it. In moments, the entire gargoyle glowed like a demon bound within divine flame, its jagged features swallowed by purity. The sight was breathtaking and eerie. But the night was thick, the moon faint. Without sunlight to sustain it, the glow began to flicker, growing dimmer by the second. "So that's how it is," Charles murmured. "If this were daytime, how much stronger would it be?" He was just about to continue experimenting when... bang! The door to his room burst open. A streak of crimson swept through the threshold. Melisandre, her expression tight with alarm. "What did you just do?" Her usually calm, melodic tone was sharp, almost panicked. Before he could answer, she crossed the room in 3 strides, pushing past him to lean out the window. The last remnants of his spell shimmered before them, the glowing cross collapsing into a cloud of white motes, scattering into the night like a swarm of fireflies. Melisandre stared, frozen. Then slowly, she turned back toward him. Her eyes, red as rubies, burned with disbelief and something else, something feverish. Her lips parted, but no words came out. They simply stared at each other, the silence heavy with unspoken meaning. The tension was so palpable, Charles finally cleared his throat and muttered. Sorry, but could you not look at me like that? I'm not into older women." Chapter 31, Chapter 31 Cautious Growth. Chapter 31 Cautious Growth. A low, chilling murmur echoed through the lower deck cabin, seeping faintly through the thin wooden door. Any sailor passing by would quicken their pace, shoulders tense, pretending not to hear. Inside, a single candle burned steadily, its flame casting long, swaying shadows across the walls. The flickering light made the cramped room seem alive, every corner breathing in rhythm with the eerie whispering that filled it. To the crew, this was no ordinary cabin. They called it the Ghost's Denmark, home of the Black Sorcerer. None dared approach after sunset. By day, the young man within seemed harmless, mild-mannered, even polite, his tone easy and his eyes bright with good humor. Yet the moment darkness fell, strange noises began to stir from his room, scratching, murmuring, the faint hum of words not meant for mortal ears. His neighbor, once a burly Dragonstone sailor, had already begged to be reassigned. The poor man was now a trembling old wreck, half-deaf, half-blind, and unwilling to even speak of what he'd heard. But if any of them had actually peeked inside that haunted cabin, their fear might have turned to laughter. Because the terrifying Black Sorcerer was, at that moment, muttering at a fish. A small, pale cod, to be exact. "Rise, damn you," Charles grumbled, waving his hand over the creature. The skull-shaped pendant in his grip glimmered faintly under the candlelight, as threads of greyish energy coiled from its surface like strands of smoke, weaving toward the fish on the wooden table. "You attempt to cast Bone Resurrection. Spell failed. You attempt to cast Bone Resurrection. Spell failed. You attempt to cast Bone Resurrection. Spell failed." One failure after another appeared before his mind's eye. Each time the incantation was spoken, the grey light sank into the fish's body, causing it to twitch once or twice, and then fall still. The once white scales darkened to a sickly blue-green, the lifeless body turning brittle and useless. A whole bucket of such test subjects already lay beside his feet. No human corpses to practice with, so he made do with fish. After all, practice wasn't about success, it was about familiarity. And the cod, at least, didn't complain. Sadly, only Bone Resurrection and Touch of Fatigue could be practiced this way. The rest of the necromantic spells required either spirits or corpses, neither of which he had on hand. Still, he could see progress in his invisible status panel. Bone Resurrection 41% proficiency. Touch of Fatigue 13% proficiency. A grin tugged at his lips. Not bad. And since the purification spell seemed to work far better here, no divine backlash, no maddening whispers, he had shifted focus to mastering it. Out of 10 attempts, 3 now succeeded. A 1 in 3 chance was far better than the 0 he'd had before. Soon, he'd test it again back in his own world. Maybe it would still work. Maybe it wouldn't. But even 50% hope was better than none. Lately, though, that success had brought complications. Like now. The door creaked open without warning. Soft footsteps measured, deliberate, unmistakable approached from behind. Charles didn't even bother turning around. "Let me guess," he said dryly, still gesturing over the fish. "Shouldn't you be off worshipping your Stannis King of Rocks? What are you doing haunting me every night? I'm not the reincarnation of whoever you keep mentioning." "Azor Ahai's reincarnation is sacred," came the familiar serene voice, "but so is the messenger of the Lord of Light." He sighed. "You've said that about 15 times already." It all started when he'd accidentally succeeded with the purification spell, the holy glow bursting from his hand. Since then, Melisandre had followed him like a shadow. "You ever seen a messenger of light dabble in necromancy?" he said, pointing at the fish bucket. Unbothered, the Red Priestess replied smoothly, "The shadow serves the light. Before I was a priestess, I was a binder of shadows. I have always dealt with darkness." Charles shot her a look. "Yeah, sure. Everyone knows where there's light, there can't be dark." She smiled faintly. "It is light that creates the dark." He rolled his eyes and gave up arguing. Ever since she'd witnessed him casting divine magic without injury or backlash, Melisandre had been convinced he was chosen, a vessel sent by her god. It explained, in her mind, why she couldn't see his past in the flames. So now she insisted on following him to guide and serve the one sent by the Lord of Light. Complete nonsense, in his opinion. Charles suspected it had far more to do with him rescuing Eddard Stark and ruining her delicate plans on Dragonstone. "I had already persuaded His Grace to embrace the Lord of Light," she said quietly, her tone tinged with restrained frustration. "But after Eddard Stark pledged himself, he refused to speak further of faith. He called it a private matter." Her crimson eyes flickered with something between annoyance and sorrow. "The Lord of Light's cause outweighs all mortal concerns," she murmured. "Everything else is merely the noise of men." Charles stared at her for a long moment, then smirked faintly. "Right. And I suppose I'm the noise that just won't go away." Every time she came to see him, the conversation was always the same few lines. No matter how Charles tried to ignore, deflect, or mock her, Melisandre would calmly repeat her cryptic preaching, as if her mind were locked in a loop. He was, quite frankly, done with it. "Think whatever you like," Charles said flatly, waving her off without looking up from his desk. "I'm not some messenger of light. And even if I were, I've got nothing urgent to do about it." "Oh." Her voice was smooth, melodic, infuriatingly patient. "Then where do you come from?" He hesitated. "And why," she continued, "do you travel in the company of House Stark?" "None of your business." He snapped before he could stop himself. What was he supposed to say? That he followed the Starks because they were convenient vessels for collecting souls? That his so-called divine purpose was rooted in necromancy? Yeah, no. Even the open-minded Stark family might hang him for that one. "Coldwater City is half a month away," Melisandre said softly, ignoring his glare. "You have time to reflect. Perhaps you do not wish to speak of your true purpose, but I believe you've merely forgotten your divine calling, your memories buried." Her crimson eyes shimmered faintly in the candlelight as she added, "Only the messenger of light can summon radiance in the depth of night. Only one chosen by the Lord of Light can wield magic without paying a price. No other being can do such a thing." With that, she cast him one last lingering look, then turned and walked away. The door clicked shut. "Honestly," Charles muttered under his breath, rolling his eyes. "Should I call her naive or just self-absorbed?" He slumped back in his chair, flicking the dead fish on the table with a sigh. And what's with this amnesia nonsense? You make up my tragic backstory before I can even object. Really, you're more creative than I am. He shook his head, deciding it wasn't worth dwelling on. Having a clingy red-robed tail following him around was annoying but not entirely bad. At least her decision to tag along had been worth the spectacle. On the day they left Dragonstone, when Melisandre suddenly declared she would accompany him, the look on the island nobles' faces had been priceless. Particularly Lady Celis Stannis's infamous, sharp-nosed wife. Her face had cycled through shock, fury, despair, and jealousy so fast it was almost a comedy sketch. Charles had barely kept a straight face. Melisandre herself might be strange, cryptic, devout, and obsessed with fire, but in truth, she hadn't shown any actual danger. For all her mystique, her power seemed more ritual than real. In this world, magic wasn't something people could freely wield. And as far as Charles knew, no one else could use it quite like him. Which meant, if he played his cards right, he could live rather comfortably here. But comfort wasn't what he wanted. His real goal remained unchanged, to grow stronger. Because the other world, the real one beyond the gate, still waited. And for a necromancer, growth always came with death. That was the purpose of his journey, to seek the boundaries of life and soul, and push past them. Unfortunately, this was a real world, where travel took time. You couldn't just teleport from place to place. Originally, their route was supposed to lead to Gulltown, under the Vale's jurisdiction, a simple half-month journey at most. But after hearing word that his sister-in-law in the Vale was unreliable, Eddard Stark had changed course entirely. He decided to avoid the Vale's heartlands and instead make landfall at a small border port on the eastern edge, then march inland to join his eldest son, Robb Stark, who had already raised banners and begun his campaign in the Riverlands. The detour doubled their travel time. There was a faster path through the war-torn Trident region, but with 2 daughters in tow, Eddard refused to risk it. Charles didn't argue. Yes, he had magic, but not the kind that could stop an arrow, or patch a knife wound. A single lucky strike, and all his spells would mean nothing. So for now, the goal was simple. Stay alive. Grow quietly. Don't draw attention. Or, as he put it more bluntly to himself, cautious development. Sneaky survival. Stay low, live long. End of chapter. Chapter 32, Chapter 32 Quiet Days. Chapter 32 Quiet Days. The sea was fickle, as always. That morning, the sky had been an endless stretch of blue, clear, bright, and warm. By afternoon, it had turned into a roiling cauldron of grey. Thick clouds gathered over the narrow sea, thunder rolled from somewhere deep within, and flashes of lightning tore through the darkened heavens like angry veins of fire. The waves responded in kind. Ships that had been sailing smoothly an hour ago now rocked violently on the swelling waters, their decks slick and unstable. Sailors shouted over the wind, their voices hoarse and panicked. Those with weaker legs stumbled from side to side, clutching ropes and masts for dear life as the sea tossed them about like rag dolls. Below deck, in a small cabin lit by flickering candles, Melisandre stood by a narrow window. Her crimson robes rippled slightly with the motion of the ship, her face composed but tense. "There shouldn't have been a storm today," she murmured. Something about it didn't feel natural. A frown creased her brow as she slipped on her boots and made for the door, only for the ship's violent rocking to suddenly stop. She froze. The roar of the wind vanished. The sea, moments ago wild and raging, fell eerily still. Even the thunder faded to a whisper as the heavy clouds broke apart, revealing a faint trace of sunlight filtering through. Melisandre's lips curved into a knowing smile. "So it was his will," she whispered. "Only the Lord of Light could so effortlessly calm the fury of the drowned god." Dash. Above deck, the ship's swaying finally eased, but Charles barely noticed. He stood in his small cabin, eyes closed, as the familiar sensation of weightlessness swept over him, followed by the warmth of air that didn't smell of salt or decay. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer surrounded by the dark timbers of a ship. Instead, golden sunlight filtered gently through the blue curtains of a balcony window. Outside, the orange hues of sunset painted the skyline of the city, his city. He was home. The sounds beyond his door were faint but familiar, the quiet bustle of servants preparing dinner downstairs, the clinking of metal dishes, the murmur of conversation, the rhythm of daily life. He wasn't in a hurry to leave his room. Instead, he took a moment to change out of the long, otherworldly robe he'd worn in the medieval realm, slipping into the casual but neat clothes he'd prepared before his departure. Then he sat by the window, exhaling softly, his mind running over everything that had happened. "Well," he muttered, rolling a small black crystal between his fingers, "if nothing else, this thing should fetch a decent price." The crystal was dark, smooth, and cold to the touch, its edges reflecting faint light like polished glass. But what caught his attention most was the faint hum of power within it. Obsidian. Or, as the people of Westeros called it, dragon glass. A relic said to be forged by the fire of the gods deep within the earth. Of course, Charles didn't buy that story, but whatever it was, this wasn't just stone. It pulsed faintly with something alive. He smiled faintly. "Tomorrow, I'll drop by the clockmaker's shop, and that detective agency. It's been long enough, they should have something for me by now." Just then, a calm, steady voice spoke from outside his door. "Master Cranston, dinner is ready." It was Grace, his newly hired housekeeper. "I'll be right there," he called back. Now that she mentioned it, he realized just how hungry he was. Medieval food hadn't been terrible, especially compared to battlefield rations, but ship meals? That was another level of misery. Pocketing the dragon glass, Charles stepped out of his room. Grace stood at attention by the door, a slim, stern woman in a neat black uniform. She was nearing 50, her brown hair streaked with white. Her face was plain but sharply defined, her thin lips giving her a look of quiet authority. She was meticulous to a fault, utterly intolerant of disorder. A perfect housekeeper, if not the most cheerful one. Aside from Grace, there were 4 other staff members, a cook, 2 maids, and a part-time laundress, all women. Not by design, but practicality. He didn't need stable boys or heavy laborers, he needed precision, cleanliness, and quiet efficiency. Descending the staircase, the scent of dinner greeted him. The long dining table was neatly set: roast pork, grilled fish, beef patties, baked potatoes, fruit salad, and a steaming pot of creamy mushroom soup. For a household of 6, it was almost excessive, but as per contract, the servants dined only after their master finished, so the abundance made sense. At the far end of the table sat a young girl with wavy brown hair and timid blue eyes. Annie. She looked up as Charles entered, hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. No greeting, but at least she didn't flee this time. Progress. After more than a week of living together, she'd finally stopped being afraid of him. It hadn't taken much, just patience, small talk, and a lack of pressure. Children, after all, forgot fear as easily as they learned it. "Waiting for me, hi," he said with a teasing smile, sitting down across from her. Annie nodded silently. She was polite, too polite for a child her age. No tantrums, no shouting, no mischief. Just calm obedience and the occasional shy glance. It wasn't normal, not really. But maybe it was her nature, or maybe it was the shadow of her past. Either way, Charles didn't mind. As her guardian, she required little effort except for one thing. "You've been taking the medicine Dr. Domo prescribed?" "Yes," she answered softly. "Feeling any better?" "A little." "Good. Tell me right away if it gets worse." Their dinner passed quietly, no laughter, no tension, just a simple rhythm of shared peace. Afterward, the servants cleared the table, and Charles bid Annie good night before retreating to his own room. The trip to the other world hadn't been dangerous, but the stress of pulling off such a reckless plan still lingered. Combined with sleepless nights on a rocking ship, exhaustion hit him hard. He barely made it to the bed before collapsing onto the velvet sheets. Within minutes, his breathing steadied, and the house fell silent. For the first time in weeks, Charles slept without dreams. The next morning, after washing up and finishing breakfast, Charles slipped into his usual refined attire, black trousers, polished leather boots, and a fitted tailcoat. He topped it off with a crisp white shirt, neatly tied cravat, and a high-crowned top hat, the latest fashion in Pita City. With his silver-handled cane in hand, he stepped out into the brisk morning air. Today's plan was simple. First, he would take the dragon glass crystal to the clockmaker's shop for appraisal, see if it was worth keeping or selling. After that, he intended to stop by the Little Imp Detective Agency, conveniently located on Martin Street, just a few doors down from the clock shop. The morning air in Pita was sharp and clean, carrying the faint salt of the distant sea. A thin layer of white mist hung low over the black stone streets, coiling lazily around lampposts and carriage wheels. The rhythmic clatter of hooves echoed across the damp cobblestones as his hired carriage rattled through the quiet city. Few pedestrians were about this early, so the streets were open and the ride quick. Barely 15 minutes later, Charles arrived at his destination. But the moment he stepped down from the carriage, he realized something was off. The detective agency was in chaos. Through the frosted glass door, he could see movement, shadows flailing, furniture toppling, and the muffled crash of fists meeting flesh. "They're fighting," he muttered. With a sigh, he turned to his driver and murmured something low before adjusting his tie and hat. Then, cane tapping lightly against the floor, he strode through the door. Inside, the place was a mess. Two groups of men were brawling amid overturned chairs and scattered papers. One of them, a burly man with a long scar running down his cheek, was clutching his bruised eye, half bent over in pain. Charles cleared his throat, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "If I were you," he said clearly, "I'd leave this place. Right now." The fighting froze. The scarred man turned toward him, glaring through his swollen eye. "Mind your own damn business, kid." He reached for a stool, ready to swing it at the tall young detective across from him. Until Charles added, in the same lazy, almost amused tone, "I'd love to, honestly. But the police might not feel the same way." The word police landed like a stone. Every head turned toward him. Even the scarred thug hesitated. "Police?" Charles gestured toward the window with his cane. "See the coachman out there? You probably recognize which direction he just went." The thug's face twitched. "You?" Before his companion could finish, the scarred man raised a hand to silence him. After glaring once more at the detective opposite him, he growled under his breath, "We'll remember this, boy." Then, shoving Charles hard in the shoulder as he passed, he and his crew stormed out the door and vanished down the street. The office fell silent. Charles straightened his coat with mild annoyance. "Pity," he murmured to himself. "I half expected to have to throw a punch or two, maybe even pull a flashy move for once. A pause. Though, without magic, I probably would have been flattened." Still thinking about that, he glanced around at the stunned employees, removed his hat with a polite smile, and greeted the person behind the desk. "Good morning, Miss Zoe." Chapter 33, Chapter 33 Information and Resonance Runes. Chapter 33 Information and Resonance Runes. As the group finally left, the tension in the room seemed to lift instantly. Counting the female detective, Zoe, there were only 3 people left, 2 men and 1 woman, while their opponents had numbered 6. Had they not been somewhat capable, they would have been flattened long ago. "Thanks." Gesturing for her partner to tidy up the mess in the office, the sharp-featured female detective approached Charles. She glanced at the door where the troublemakers had just exited and said calmly, "Those people were relatives of that bald police officer. I dug a little too deep into his affairs, and, well, I might have ruffled his feathers. I'm sorry to hear that." Charles said the words, but not a trace of guilt crossed his face. Business was business. They were simply in a client-contractor relationship. Since he had paid, all he needed to do was wait for results. Whatever mishaps occurred in between had nothing to do with him. It wasn't as if there were any personal feelings involved. If you were a bit more ladylike, I might have mistaken this for a hero saving the damsel moment, he remarked, half teasing, his eyes landing on the faint bruise on her cheek. Would a lady ever do this kind of work? She gave a short laugh, then motioned for him to sit. From the cluttered table, she found a kettle and poured him a cup of tea. You're here for the results, I assume. Exactly. How did the investigation go? Weiler Rosen, age 46. Former first mate of the Bluebird, Royal Navy of Doolan. Rank, Lieutenant. After retirement, he was invited by Mayor Fegrin of Pita City to serve as the city's chief of police. Currently residing at. She spoke fluently and without pause, her tone brisk and precise. There was no paper, no notes, yet she recited the information as though she had memorized every detail. Charles listened silently, not interrupting once. After finishing her report on the bald police chief, she smoothly transitioned into other findings. There's been nothing particularly notable in Kenyon Town lately aside from the mayor marrying his third wife, and the blacksmith's youngest son leaving for the city to seek fortune, only to end up a beggar and come crawling back. She paused briefly, then continued, a few years ago, the townsfolk reportedly stopped and expelled a visiting noble, the heir to a barony, from entering the local castle. At that, she glanced at Charles, gauging his expression. Seeing no reaction, she carried on. The townspeople claimed the castle harbors a sleeping demon, one that would awaken and slaughter everyone if disturbed. The church didn't intervene? Charles asked. They did, she replied, shaking her head. But they found nothing unusual. So someone's clearly pulling the strings, Charles muttered under his breath. Ignoring his discontent, the detective continued. Baroness Rhine was born to a prominent noble family in the capital. She inherited her late mother's cousin's estate, remained unmarried all her life, and died suddenly of a heart condition. When she passed, the only person by her side was an adopted girl she took in 2 years prior. No other relatives were present. Her hobbies included. The list went on for some time, but one remark lingered in Charles's mind long after he left the detective's office. They say, shortly before her death, Baroness Rhine was trying to cure her adopted daughter. That single line echoed in his thoughts as he walked through the dim streets, lost in contemplation. From the information gathered, he could tell one thing: the people of Kenyon Town were being manipulated. By whom, he couldn't yet tell, but it was clear there was a deliberate hand behind their hostility. Perhaps I'll need the church after all, he murmured, mulling over the issue of inheritance. If the church had investigated and found nothing, then there likely wasn't any real demon in that castle. The locals' paranoia had to be fueled by someone's influence. Whoever was behind it didn't matter for now. Once he entered the castle and retrieved his family's heirloom, the matter of his title would settle itself. Then no one would dare stop him, outsider or not. Even in this era, when noble privilege had lost much of its former weight, aristocratic titles still carried undeniable influence. And for ordinary people, even a fallen noble house was something to tread around carefully. Once I master the purification chant, I'll pay the church a visit, Charles decided, exhaling softly. I'll mention this matter then. His study of the chant was going smoothly. He would likely master it soon, though that would bring another kind of test. Would using the spiritual tongue in the real world trigger another attack from them? He couldn't be sure. There was at least a 50-50 chance. And if it didn't work at all, he'd best start planning his escape instead of dreaming about noble titles. With that thought, Charles didn't head home. Instead, he walked straight to the clockmaker's shop. The same elderly man with the monocle greeted him. As always, the shop was quiet, eerily so, as if no one else ever stepped foot inside. After a few polite exchanges, Charles placed the black crystal on the counter. An elemental crystal. The old man picked it up and studied it briefly before nodding. Yes. These are quite versatile, used in ritual magic, spell enhancement, alchemical enchantments, and even for crafting devices inscribed with resonance runes. Is it worth much? Charles asked bluntly. Not particularly, functionally speaking, the man replied. But it's rare, so it has value. If you're selling, I can offer £1 and 3 shillings. If you'd rather keep it for use, though you'll need a matching resonance runes. Resonance runes? Yes. It's a form of magical writing, something every spellcaster must learn. You're not quite at that level yet. However. The old man's tone softened into a sly hum. If you hand this crystal over to me, I could give you a complete set of compatible resonance runes in exchange. The kind you can use right away. It's a form of magical writing, a discipline every spellcaster must master. You're not quite ready for it yet, but... He paused, then added with a faint smile, if you hand this crystal over to me, I could give you a complete set of compatible scripts. Ones you could use right away. How about compatible resonance runes? Before the old man could finish, a loud voice boomed from behind. Charles turned to see a tall man of dark, bronze-brown skin stepping into the shop. His broad frame and square jaw gave him the look of a mountain tribesman, massive, thick-set, his shaven face marked by rolls of flesh that made his eyes seem unnaturally small. Those narrow eyes were fixed squarely on the crystal in Charles's hand. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, and his fine clothes suggested wealth. Clearly, a regular customer. The shopkeeper's expression, however, soured immediately. Eddie, he said coldly, don't think I don't know what you're after. This young man is with the church. The church? The man Eddie froze, then sighed. Ah, that's so? Then forget it. I'm not stupid enough to cross them. He started to move past the counter toward the inner corridor, but Charles stopped him. Wait. You said you have compatible resonance runes. Of course I do. Eddie gave him a sidelong glance, his interest faint but present. Would you trade for them? Like you mentioned earlier. For a normal deal. Eddie snorted. You'd need at least 10 of those crystals. 10. Charles turned toward the shopkeeper. The old man only shrugged. Thinking for a moment, Charles asked, where can I find you? Eddie studied him for a few seconds, then grinned faintly. Just tell the old man here you're looking for me. He'll know how to reach me. With that, he pushed open the side door and disappeared from view. Charles stood there, deep in thought. Behind the counter, the old man shook his head. I don't know what your connection to the church really is, he said quietly, but that man is trouble. If you're not truly one of them, you'd best avoid dealing with him. Then, curiosity got the better of him. So tell me, what is your connection to the church? A new initiate? Maybe, Charles said with a shrug. They've asked me to practice a spell called purification. What do you think that means? That's quite clear, the old man said. His eyes softened slightly, almost pitying. Charles didn't notice. He kept speaking, absent-mindedly. Too bad I'm slow at it. Every now and then I keep hearing strange voices, it's incredibly annoying. The old man's expression changed slightly. That's called the voice of Ulm. Everyone who studies divine magic under the church must endure it. It's a trial. Once you fully master the chant, the voices will fade. Fully master? Charles asked, intrigued. The old man seemed to know more than he let on. When you can switch between the states instantly, he said simply. Is there no shortcut? No way to skip that phase altogether? The old man shook his head. Impossible. Can you become a master swordsman without training? It's the same principle. The soul must be trained, just like the body. So chanting spells is a kind of spiritual exercise. Exactly. And the true goal is to eventually abandon the chant entirely. Abandon it? Then how does one cast spells? In truth, the old man said, his tone patient, the words are only a crutch for beginners. Skilled spellcasters rarely speak their incantations unless they're performing a sacrificial rite. His words lingered in Charles's mind long after he left the shop. Chapter 34, Chapter 34 The Terrifying Purification Rite. Chapter 34 The Terrifying Purification Rite. The great cathedral loomed high beneath a dome adorned with carved reliefs and vibrant murals of the gods. At its far end stood a magnificent, arched window of stained glass, blazing with 7 colors. Sunlight streamed through it like liquid gold, scattering across the marble floor in dazzling hues that seemed almost divine, like the descent of heavenly light itself. At the center of the dais stood a statue of a faceless, wing-bound angel. The figure's smooth, featureless face seemed to gaze silently downward upon the scene below, a man bound tightly to an iron cross. Calling him a man was perhaps generous. His entire body was covered in short, dark fur from his cheeks to his elbows, down to his ankles, like some grotesque throwback of evolution. His eyes burned with a feral madness that made him look more beast than human. He howled incoherently, his guttural roars echoing in the vaulted space. The noises were ugly, dissonant, grating to the ear, yet the white-robed congregation surrounding him watched without flinching. To them, he was no different from a carcass laid on a butcher's table or a maggot squirming in filth. Standing among them were the highest clerics of Pita City. Auxiliary Bishop Stiller, Father LeBlanc, Brother Worshie, Brother Schumann, Sister Lisa, White Deacon Alric, White Deacon Rishi, and others, unnamed yet no less devout. It seemed that every clergyman in the diocese had gathered save for Bishop Charles, who oversaw the entire district. They formed a ring around the platform, all eyes fixed upon the bound creature and the young man standing before it just a few paces apart. The youth wore a gentleman's black attire, dark coat, black trousers, polished boots. His hair and eyes were equally black, giving him a somber, austere appearance. Against the sea of white robes, he looked like a single blot of ink. Yet, curiously, the clergy regarded him not with hostility, but with a subdued warmth, perhaps even a hint of respect. "Begin," came a calm voice. It was Brother Worshie. The young man nodded without turning. His right hand tightened around a small crucifix entwined with thorns. Raising it before him, he fixed his eyes on the struggling figure bound to the cross. He drew in a deep breath and began to speak. A deep, resonant chant filled the cathedral. The sound was not entirely human. Beneath the rising, rhythmic syllables of an ancient tongue, there was a haunting undertone, as though unseen choirs whispered through the vaulted air. The faint light shining from behind the angel statue grew brighter, enveloping the chamber in a shimmering haze. The chant reverberated across the vast, hollow hall, magnified by echo until it seemed to shake the very stone. Many of the clergy bowed their heads, faces radiant with reverence and awe. But the man bound to the iron cross reacted very differently. He screamed. His body convulsed, his mouth spat curses and meaningless syllables in rapid succession until the words choked off. Then came the burning. A hiss of smoke rose from his forehead, followed by the faint scent of scorched flesh. There, at the center of his brow, a small mark began to glow, a fiery cross, forming slowly as though branded into him by invisible hands. It rotated, sinking deeper into his flesh, searing it apart. The skin bubbled, reddened, folded in on itself like melting wax. The air filled with a sharp, unbearable scream, high-pitched, hoarse, raw with agony. And that was only the beginning. The chant continued. The radiant cross grew brighter, feeding on the surrounding light. Even after the young man's voice faded into silence, the mark spun faster, blazing hotter, as though it drew power from the very air itself. A hole burned through the man's forehead, his blood sizzling into vapor under the heat. Beneath it, his skull gleamed pale and cracked, the faint sound of bone creaking like a log in fire. Then came the light. A soft, milky white radiance began to spread from his forehead down his neck, over his entire body. His voice broke, his screams dwindled into a rasp, and the blinding heat coursed through him like molten light. Around the dais, the gathered clergy began to smile. The creature's clothes ignited. His hair curled and blackened. Blisters bloomed across his skin, swelling, bursting, collapsing in waves. The temperature climbed, searing and relentless. The purification continued for what felt like an eternity, perhaps a quarter of an hour, until the bound figure was completely swallowed by a cocoon of pure white light. Within that radiant shroud, no one could see what remained of the man at all. He was gone, or perhaps, finally cleansed. When the cocoon of light finally burst, it did so with a thunderous boom. A blinding flash filled the cathedral before revealing what was left behind: an iron cross wreathed in burning thorns, glowing crimson from the heat, and beneath it, nothing but a small mound of blackened ash. No bones remained. Charles stared blankly at the sight, his mind momentarily blank, while around him, the hall erupted into applause. "Well done! Every time a new believer joins our ranks, I can't help but feel like singing. Welcome to the church, Sir Cranston. May the Lord be with you." "Thank you, thank you." Charles smiled stiffly, forcing polite replies to this crowd of strangers. The corners of his lips ached from the effort, and his face had gone numb from feigned composure. Thankfully, the crowd soon dispersed, each cleric busy with their own duties, leaving him with some space to breathe. As Father Alric departed, he gave Charles a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Only Brother Worshie remained, smiling warmly as he clapped Charles gently on the shoulder. "Well done, young man. Half a month of practice, not exactly fast," Charles said modestly. "But not slow, either," Worshie replied, still wearing his serene smile. "If you've mastered purification, it means you are without sin. There's no doubt about that." "So, what happens next?" Charles asked cautiously. He didn't for a second believe this grand ritual had been held merely for show. It felt far more like an initiation, one designed to mark him publicly as part of the church. "You've probably already guessed what we intend," said Worshie softly. "What are your thoughts?" "As if I actually have a choice," Charles muttered inwardly. Out loud, he said, "Naturally, I'd be honored to join the church. But I have family responsibilities, business I can't abandon, and the duty of continuing the Cranston bloodline. I fear I can't devote myself entirely to serving the Lord of Thorns." The truth was, he was frightened. That spell he had just cast, the purification chant, was his own, yes, but he had never used it on a living person before. The sheer power of it, the destructive heat, the sound of burning flesh, it was far beyond what he'd imagined. If that kind of energy ever turned on him, he doubted even ashes would remain. The spell was supposed to target only creatures of darkness, but Charles couldn't shake the unease in his chest. He hadn't forgotten what he was learning, nor the strange, conflicting nature of his power. Could those opposing forces one day collide? Could his own magic turn inward and consume him? Yet Brother Worshie clearly had no intention of letting him walk away. "We've already considered such cases," he said kindly. "In fact, there are many within the church who share your situation. That's why you have two options." "Two?" Charles raised a brow. In his understanding, church members all lived the same kind of life: no marriage, no possessions, endless discipline and routine. "The first option," Worshie began, "is to serve as a semi-independent demon hunter. You'd travel across the kingdom, completing monthly assignments. The church would provide supplies, resources, and opportunities for advancement. It offers a great deal of freedom." Charles's expression didn't change much. The idea of running all over the country didn't appeal to him in the slightest, especially now that he possessed the means to move through portals at will. "And the second?" he asked. "The second path is as an external member of the church, Worshi explained. You would still receive tasks, but they'd be local near your home. The benefits, however, are minimal. Aside from emergencies involving life and death, we wouldn't intervene to aid you. To acquire spells or magical artifacts, you'd need to make your own contributions. He paused, then added with a knowing smile, but like the demon hunters, this path doesn't forbid marriage. So, he said gently, which will you choose? Charles didn't hesitate. I'll take the second option, he said. A shadow of relief crossed Worshi's face, as though he'd expected the answer all along. Very well, he said. Then, Brother Cranston, welcome to the church's outer circle. Charles wasn't foolish enough to ask, and what if I refuse all of them? The priest had been nothing but courteous so far, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath that gentleness. Best not to test how sharp it was. Brother Worshi didn't seem surprised by the choice. He nodded approvingly. Very well. As an external member, you won't wear the church's uniform, but you'll receive an official hunter's certificate, stamped with the seal of Dulin Cathedral. It's valid across all kingdoms. With it, you can requisition aid from local law enforcement when needed, though each request must first be reported to the central diocese for approval. He spoke in that calm, measured tone unique to those who'd spent a lifetime preaching rules. Each month, new externals are assigned one mission, he continued. You must always be ready. We never know when the forces of darkness may awaken. In time, once your certificate arrives, we'll share with you more about the Church's higher doctrines and the opportunities they offer. Charles nodded along, though inwardly he rolled his eyes. No room to refuse. No freedom. Mediocre benefits. It all sounded suspiciously like being drafted into a holy pyramid scheme. Brother Worshi, oblivious to the young man's thoughts, carried on his long lecture about sacred laws and spiritual obedience. His droning voice was enough to make even the candles flicker from boredom. Finally, as if remembering something important, he added, one more thing. Regardless of rank, attacking a servant of the Church is considered a grave sin. Should you find yourself in trouble, you may reveal your true affiliation for protection. He fixed Charles with a stern gaze. But remember, privilege comes with obligation. Break the Church's laws, and not even the gods will shield you. Understood, Charles replied, nodding sincerely. This part, at least, sounded useful. But then came the statement that truly caught his attention. Your future, said the old priest, depends on how far you can ascend. You're not yet 17, you have remarkable potential. Ascend? Charles raised a brow. You mean, a higher rank? Something greater than that, Worshi said cryptically. Those who walk the path of righteousness need not seek miracles, the gods walk beside them already. You'll understand, in time. Charles wasn't sure if that was wisdom or nonsense, but he smiled politely and took his leave. As his footsteps faded, another robed figure approached from the shadows. An elderly monk, thin and pale, peered after the retreating youth and murmured, I didn't think he'd survive. The voice of Ulm. I thought he'd break or fail entirely. Charles would have recognized him as the same priest who'd helped interrogate him during his first encounter with the Church. Brother Worshi sighed. Nor did I. But it's a good sign. Enduring the voice proves he can be trusted. The elder priest hesitated, then lowered his tone. About his aunt's case. I think he might be the key. That notebook. He never finished. Because at that moment, the tent flap flew open again. Charles returned, his expression calm but his grip tight around the collar of a struggling, thin man in a blue coat. Brother Worshi frowned. Child, that's hardly a polite way to treat someone. Charles dropped the man unceremoniously to the ground. He attacked me, he said simply. That single word froze the priests. Attacked. Worshi's brows knit. He turned to the blue-clad stranger, whose eyes darted between them, panicked. Meanwhile, The elder priest let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. He's only been with us a day, and already he's brought trouble to our door. Chapter 35, Chapter 35 Quite the tiger skin. Chapter 35 Quite the tiger skin. Charles wasn't foolish enough to ask, and what if I refuse all of them? The priest had been nothing but courteous so far, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath that gentleness. Best not to test how sharp it was. Brother Worshi didn't seem surprised by the choice. He nodded approvingly. Very well. As an external member, you won't wear the church's uniform, but you'll receive an official witch hunter's certificate, stamped with the seal of Dulin Cathedral. It's valid across all kingdoms. With it, you can requisition aid from local law enforcement when needed, though each request must first be reported to the central diocese for approval. He spoke in that calm, measured tone unique to those who'd spent a lifetime preaching rules. Each month, new externals are assigned one mission, he continued. You must always be ready. We never know when the forces of darkness may awaken. In time, once your certificate arrives, we'll share with you more about the Church's higher doctrines and the opportunities they offer. Charles nodded along, though inwardly he rolled his eyes. No room to refuse. No freedom. Mediocre benefits. It all sounded suspiciously like being drafted into a holy pyramid scheme. Brother Worshi, oblivious to the young man's thoughts, carried on his long lecture about sacred laws and spiritual obedience. His droning voice was enough to make even the candles flicker from boredom. Finally, as if remembering something important, he added, one more thing. Regardless of rank, attacking a servant of the Church is considered a grave sin. Should you find yourself in trouble, you may reveal your true affiliation for protection. He fixed Charles with a stern gaze. But remember, privilege comes with obligation. Break the Church's laws, and not even the gods will shield you. Understood, Charles replied, nodding sincerely. This part, at least, sounded useful. But then came the statement that truly caught his attention. Your future, said the old priest, depends on how far you can ascend. You're not yet 17, you have remarkable potential. Ascend? Charles raised a brow. You mean, a higher rank? Something greater than that, Worshi said cryptically. Those who walk the path of righteousness need not seek miracles, the gods walk beside them already. You'll understand, in time. Charles wasn't sure if that was wisdom or nonsense, but he smiled politely and took his leave. As his footsteps faded, another robed figure approached from the shadows. An elderly monk, thin and pale, peered after the retreating youth and murmured, I didn't think he'd survive the voice of Ulm. I thought he'd break or fail entirely. Charles would have recognized him as the same priest who'd helped interrogate him during his first encounter with the Church. Brother Worshi sighed. Nor did I. But it's a good sign. Enduring the voice proves he can be trusted. The elder priest hesitated, then lowered his tone. About his aunt's case. I think he might be the key. That notebook. He never finished. Because at that moment, the tent flap flew open again. Charles returned, his expression calm but his grip tight around the collar of a struggling, thin man in a blue coat. Brother Worshi frowned. Child, that's hardly a polite way to treat someone. Charles dropped the man unceremoniously to the ground. He attacked me, he said simply. That single word froze the priests. Attacked. Worshi's brows knit. He turned to the blue-clad stranger, whose eyes darted between them, panicked. Meanwhile, the elder priest let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. He's only been with us a day, and already he's brought trouble to our door. Who instructed you to attack Mr. Cranston? Though Brother Worshi's voice was as calm and gentle as ever, warm as spring sunlight, his eyes were cold enough to freeze bone. Charles had only just joined the Church, and already someone had dared to ambush him right under the Church's shadow, no less. An insult, plain and simple. I'm with the Grey Rat Gang, stammered the blue-clad errand boy. Our boss told us to rough him up a little, just a little lesson, nothing more. The two other clerics standing beside Wershi frowned in disgust. The church despised anything born of darkness, and street gangs were no exception. Still, they tolerated such organizations. At times they were a necessary evil, occasionally more effective than the authorities themselves. Brother Wershi turned to Charles, his tone light and polite again. The church won't interfere in such trivial matters. However, I'm sure the police will give you a proper explanation. His voice was kind, almost reassuring, but Charles vividly remembered the look on this same man's face during the purification rite, how he'd smiled, almost blissfully, as that creature burned alive. If that ever happens to me, Charles thought uneasily, I'm dead. Outwardly, he kept his expression calm and nodded respectfully. He assumed the matter would end there, but Brother Wershi apparently had other plans. With quiet efficiency, he sat down and penned a formal letter on the spot. When finished, he handed it to a nearby cleric and instructed him to escort the captured thug straight to the police. Perhaps it was just a gesture to win favor, but still Charles had to admit, the man got things done. His impression of Wershi improved slightly. Since his involvement was no longer needed, Charles decided to wait for the outcome at home. After a courteous farewell to the clerics, he stepped into a black carriage and rode back through the city. But to his surprise, the result was already waiting for him when he arrived. Good afternoon, Sir Cranston. The bald police chief Weiler Rosen himself, the same man who had once strutted into his home full of arrogance, now stood up from the sofa in the sitting room with an awkward smile plastered across his face. What is it this time? Charles said flatly, taking off his coat and hanging it neatly by the door. Here to give me trouble again? Not at all, not at all, Rosen said quickly. I'm here to apologize. Charles froze mid-motion, then slowly turned his head toward him. Behind the sofa, half hidden from view, knelt a large man with his arms bound behind his back. The man was burly, his features square but his beady eyes twitchy and nervous. He looked up at Charles with a forced, pitiful smile. Grey Rat Gang, I presume? Charles asked. The man nodded frantically. Charles blinked, momentarily dazed. He looked between the bound thug and the uneasy police chief standing beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu. He already knew the Grey Rat Gang had ties to Rosen. Detective Zoe had uncovered as much during her investigation, which was precisely how she'd gotten into trouble. Charles had simply been dragged into it afterward. But this? To see Police Chief Weiler Rosen personally escorting his own associate to beg forgiveness? That was unexpected. Was it more shocking that the church's influence reached this far, or that a city's chief of police had such cozy relations with the underworld? Suppressing his thoughts, Charles said casually, well, since the culprit's been caught, just go through proper trial procedures. Why come to me? The commissioner insists we must follow your wishes, Rosen replied humbly, bowing slightly. His expression was docile, but his eyes flickered with resentment. A week ago, this man had thought Charles was as good as dead, and now, suddenly, the same nobody had the church behind him. Life really did have a dark sense of humor. Charles smirked. Oh, come now. I'm just a small fry myself. I haven't even inherited my title yet. The words made Rosen's face tighten. It's only a matter of time, sir, he said quickly. That's true, Charles mused aloud, tapping his chin. But tell me, wasn't it you who once said, let's wait until you inherit the title, then we'll talk? Remind me again who said that. I. Rosen faltered, sweat forming on his brow. So, Charles continued lazily, do you think it'd be better for me to inherit the title sooner, or not at all? The police chief's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no answer. Charles sighed theatrically and sank into the sofa across from him, crossing one leg over the other. You know, he said, you're far too ugly for me to enjoy talking to you. But tell me who ordered the attack, and we can call it even. And no one ordered it. Rosen stammered. We just got a report. Hat. Your butler filed it, he's the one who gave us the lead. Ah, I see, Charles interrupted smoothly. So you're still clinging to that same old attitude. Wait until he inherits the title, then we'll talk. In that case, I guess we have nothing more to say. Though, honestly, I don't know why you're so nervous. I'm just a penniless noble, after all. You have great prospects, sir, Rosen said through gritted teeth, still smiling. I wouldn't dare compare myself to you. I was only doing my duty. Duty, my ass, he cursed silently, forcing his face to stay pleasant. Charles merely shrugged and started inspecting his fingernails, glancing idly at the bound thug on the floor. Seeing this, Rosen clenched his jaw. If words wouldn't help, perhaps a little misdirection would. To be honest, sir, I didn't even know what they wanted from you. Last time I came here, it wasn't personal. The commissioner told me to gauge your background. So you provoked me on purpose? Charles asked sharply, his gaze shifting. I had no choice. No choice. Charles tilted his head. To the point you'd manipulate an innocent girl just to do it. Rosen's face turned pale. That. He faltered. Charles let him squirm a bit longer before suddenly straightening his posture. The mockery vanished from his tone. All right, he said quietly. I believe you've shown enough sincerity. How about this? Help me with something, and we'll call it even. My cousin. Rosen began, nodding toward the bound man beside him. Since we're friends now, Charles interrupted, then there's no need to hold grudges, right? Rosen's jaw tightened. In truth, he despised the idea of helping this smug little brat, but the commissioner's order had been clear, either make peace, or watch the Grey Rat Gang's leader rot in prison. Jail time wasn't the worst fate, but losing control of the gang would ruin years of work and profits. So, here he was, groveling. For a cousin, no less. Of course, Rosen said, forcing a grin. Whatever you need done, we'll see it through. He prayed silently that Charles wouldn't ask for anything unreasonable. Unfortunately for him, that prayer went unanswered. It's simple, Charles said lightly. Tomorrow, I'm heading to Kenyon Town. I'd like you to send a team of officers to accompany me. It'd be awfully pitiful for a nobleman to travel alone, don't you think? Hearing Charles's request, Chief Rosen's face darkened and brightened by turns. On the surface, it wasn't a difficult favor, but the implications behind it, those were another story. After a long pause, he clenched his jaw and forced a smile. I think you're absolutely right, my lord. A baron of your standing ought to have a proper escort and some show of dignity. Exactly, Charles replied cheerfully. See? It's a simple matter, no trouble at all. I never make things hard for my friends. Hat, hat, hat. Rosen's laugh was dry as sandpaper. With that, the issue was settled. After a few more perfunctory exchanges, the bald police chief quickly took his leave, dragging along his still silent cousin, the unfortunate gang leader. Judging by his haste, he was eager to report back and close this embarrassing chapter once and for all. Charles watched the two retreating figures and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Joining the church might have brought its share of inconveniences and possibly, someday, the risk of burning himself alive, but at the moment, it wasn't without its perks. After all, that bald man was no small figure. As the chief of police in Pita City, second only to the commissioner and deputy commissioner, Rosen was practically a local overlord, a man who usually inspired fear wherever he went. Yet just now, he'd been groveling like a servant. Charles smirked to himself. Well, that's quite a tiger skin I've draped over my shoulders. But almost immediately, his amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of caution. Until I finish mastering the full disguise trio, he muttered, I mustn't use necromancy in the physical world, not unless I want to get caught. He exhaled in relief at the thought. Thank heavens for those 3 spells. Without them, the risk of exposure would be immense even before worrying about whether the conflicting magics might literally cause him to combust. Give up? That had never been an option. Ever since that night when he'd been locked in confinement and managed to summon Skeleton No One, his path had already been sealed. There was no turning back now. Abandoning necromancy wouldn't erase what he'd already done. His black history existed, recorded in the unseen world. If anyone ever found out, the result would be the same, death. Better, then, to keep walking forward. Keep training. Perhaps, when the day came, that power might actually save his life. He could only hope his secret would remain hidden for as long as possible. As for the risk of self-immolation, well, that was only a theory of his own. There wasn't a single text or teacher who'd ever mentioned magic conflict causing spontaneous combustion. So what was there to hesitate about? He'd simply be careful. Lost in thought, Charles didn't notice the quiet glances exchanged by the servants nearby. Everyone in Pita City knew Chief Rosen. He was ruthless, cunning, and unflinchingly efficient. His reputation wasn't exactly bad, but it certainly wasn't good. His rumored dealings with the city's gangs only made him more intimidating, a man no ordinary citizen would dare to offend. And yet, in front of their young master, that same fearsome man had bowed his head like a chastised apprentice. "Master Charles isn't even 17 yet, right?" whispered one maid. "Not yet, he just came of age," another replied. "I heard Viscount Russell's second son is about his age," said a third. "Saw him yesterday at old Jack's gambling hall, clutching his pockets as he left. Must have lost another pile of gold." The maids exchanged glances, shaking their heads with a sigh. People really couldn't be compared. Viscount Russell was one of the wealthiest men in all of Pita City, owner of vineyards, steelworks, and a chain of tailoring shops, with shares even in the Third Bank of Doolin. A true power among nobles. And yet his sons were both disappointments. The elder served in the Royal Navy for years without distinction, and the younger was infamous for his vices: gambling, whoring, and idleness, a perfect portrait of a degenerate noble, despised by the townsfolk, including the very maids gossiping now. What they didn't know, however, was that the young master they were praising and the Viscount's disgraceful son they were mocking, were, in fact, drinking companions. In another life, the old Charles had even borrowed money from him.